Role-playing games have existed for both the Japanese and Western fronts of gaming since the early days of computers such as the MS-DOS and Apple II, and home video game consoles such as the Nintendo Famicom. Early hits such as the Wizardry and Ultima series on computers helped set the staple for console RPGs such as Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy on the Famicom, and more would be expanded from the lesser-known companies to the more well-known entities in the gaming industry. During the 80s and 90s, Japanese role-playing games held such a dominant presence toward many gamers in both its native homeland of Japan and to that of North America and Europe, but most of the JRPGs from the Western territories would only be appreciated as cult followings since the genre was very niche during those times. Franchises like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy would help stem birth to other franchises that are strictly JRPG, or include elements of that genre into their own design structures. Companies like Enix would have Dragon Quest at the forefront of their JRPG franchises, Square would have Final Fantasy leading the pack, Atlus would have Megami Tensei as its flagship series of JRPGs, and Nihon Falcom would have both the Ys and the Legend of Heroes IPs being their own original innovations. With the arrival of the Super Famicom and Sega Mega Drive, Japanese role-playing games became more widely appreciated when many of those original IPs of the genre saw the beginning of an era that was called the Golden Age of JRPGs. Aside from Square, Enix, and Atlus having so many JRPGs coming from under their belts, many others that were birthed and heralded around the earliest parts of the decade would be the Breath of Fire franchise by Capcom, the Tales series by Namco, and many others that would mostly appear on the Super Famicom. However, Nintendo's own rival Sega had their own JRPGs that would appear on the Mega Drive, the Sega CD, and even on Sega Saturn, with Phantasy Star being at the forefront, while Lunar would appear at the forefront for Game Arts. Phantasy Star would not be the only creation done under the Sega brand, as a new challenger would arrive and step up to the plate. Aside from having a strong presence with their own library of games done by so many development teams ranging from Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, Shinobi, and even Phantasy Star, Sega's own consumer development division had 3 teams who worked on their own games before they all formed under different names before Sonic the Hedgehog was released to a worldwide audience. A 4th team under Sega's consumer development division was in the works of being formed, but it was renamed as Sonic Software Planning, with its leader being that of Hiroyuki Takahashi, who was previously employed by Enix, and served as an executive producer for Dragon Quest II. The key members of the development studio would be Hiroyuki Takahashi and his brother Shugo Takahashi, as their business venture was more in tandem to that of a partnership. Sonic Software Planning's first outing on the Sega Mega Drive would be Shining into the Darkness in 1991. It became extremely well received from a global scale, and it helped set the standard for Japanese console RPGs in Europe, since they would not see a Final Fantasy game until Final Fantasy VII's release in 1997. Even though Shining into the Darkness became a great hit, it would be succeeded next year with Shining Force being Sonic Software Planning's take on tactical RPGs, which has been a big deal when it came to Fire Emblem from Nintendo. Shining Force also became a smash hit for Sonic Software Planning, and it seemed that Sega managed to score another franchise to rival that of what was seen on the Super Famicom at the time. The Shining series would continue to thrive in many different forms in the JRPG format on many of Sega's platforms, with most of the original games being worked on by Hiroyuki Takahashi and his team. By the time when Shining Force 3 would arrive on the Sega Saturn, Sonic Software Planning would rename their studio, in which everyone would know them for today as Camelot Software Planning, now with the development studio being more independent than being strictly owned by Sega. When Shining Force 3 arrived onto the scene, and with there being 3 overlapping volumes to come out that dealt with different scenarios with different characters of the same game, friction arose within Camelot Software Planning when it came to Sega's business decisions in the home console market. After the first 2 volumes of Shining Force 3 were released, the 3rd and final volume was facing certain jeopardy of being cancelled, as Sega was beginning to focus all of their resources on the Sega Dreamcast, which was to come out in Japan in 1998. The 3rd scenario volume managed to release, but the publicity was hardly that present, based on that sentiment from Sega alone. Because of the short lifespan that the Sega Saturn was deemed to have, the poor treatment of the development studio with Sega being more in favor of their next generation console, and foreseeing a bleak future with the Sega brand, Hiroyuki Takahashi, his brother, and those within Camelot Software Planning completely closed their ties with Sega, as they went and established a long-term partnership with Nintendo. From there, Camelot Software Planning would be the studio in charge of working on spin-offs in the Super Mario franchise, which mainly consisted of the sports golf and tennis. Nintendo has made golf and tennis games during their early years in the video game scene, as Mario was hardly present in the first installments to Nintendo's venture into various sports titles, but their mascot would finally make leeway into them when NES Open Tournament Golf came out in 1991, and with Mario's Tennis releasing on the Virtual Boy in 1995. However, Mario's venture into golf and tennis games wouldn't take the world by storm until Camelot Software Planning made a Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color variation of Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, which both versions of both games became smash hits, that it seemed the relationship between the developer and publisher was bound to be an everlasting one. Since then, Camelot Software Planning has been Nintendo's go-to studio for more Mario Golf and Mario Tennis games, with their next iterations on the GameCube and Game Boy Advance continuing their winning streak for both sub-series of Mario sports titles, but their most recent ventures between the Nintendo 3DS and Nintendo Wii U have seen a drastic decline in quality due to Nintendo being more prone to push for gimmicks and playing things safe instead of being told to improve from prior outings. During their time with developing many of these Mario sports games that dealt with tennis and golf, Hiroyuki Takahashi and Shugo Takahashi wanted to develop a new game where they could retread back to their past roots with JRPGs, and their newest game would end up as one of the most rich and eclectic games under Nintendo's catalog of IPs that still holds a dedicated legion of fans to this very day. Seeing as how Japanese role-playing games were still very niche, and with massive support of the genre being hardly present in their hardware, Nintendo looked at Camelot Software Planning to develop a new game to try and reinvigorate the genre on their own platforms. The Takahashi Brothers looked back at their development of the Shining series for the Sega platforms, and they would help fit what Hiroyuki and Shugo Takahashi would envision as their newest creation for the Nintendo platforms. Camelot Software Planning originally intended for this new game to be created as a single title, with a game design document already conceived and put together as it was going to appear on the Nintendo 64, since JRPGs were very obscure on the platform. However, when it became very apparent that the Nintendo 64 was going to be superseded by its successor, the Nintendo GameCube, Camelot shifted their focus to making their newest game on Nintendo's upcoming 32-bit handheld, the Game Boy Advance. Creating a new JRPG with it being in 3D most likely wasn't in the Takahashi Brothers' best interest, since games in that field still haven't fully found their footing into the market after Final Fantasy VII evolved the genre on the Sony PlayStation. Although Camelot Software Planning has experimented 3D game development in some form, as they created a game on the Sony PlayStation called Beyond the Beyond that used 2D sprites in a 3D setting, much like Breath of Fire 3 and 4 from Capcom. While its music and presentation were greatly lauded by critics, the game was unanimously panned for its complex dungeons, frequent random encounters, and the steep difficulty on bosses, despite the game garnering underground interest from a small cult following. That is when it was decided for this new JRPG on the Nintendo consoles that made them decide to go back to their roots from what they achieved on the Sega platforms to something that is primarily 2D based like the Game Boy Advance. So developing this JRPG on a platform that was primarily sprite based ended up giving them the opportunity to remain within their roots without having to feel obligated in creating anything with 3D polygonal models. The Takahashi Brothers' newest game would be conceived under the name Golden Sun. Rather than being a tactics game, which the Shining Force games were mostly noteworthy for, Golden Sun ended up as a traditional JRPG, as a way to not only hook in their prior audience from their prior franchise, but it would be made with it being accessible to the inexperienced, while being deep in its overall structure. Camelot spent between a year and a half with developing Golden Sun, and the developer saw its creation was considered a long time for a handheld, as they could get things done much quicker for what they made with the Shining series. Seeing as how the Sega Genesis was a 16-bit platform, while the Game Boy Advance is a 32-bit handheld, one can understand how much more resources were needed to develop a game. Still wanting to undergo their philosophy to make their newest game end up as one complete package, one of the things that Hiroyuki and Shugo Takahashi wanted to do was incorporate two storylines that dealt with a side of good characters and a side of bad characters, a concept which the developer managed to do with Shining Force 3 on the Sega Saturn. However, the Takahashi brothers ran into a dilemma. Seeing as how handhelds had much more limited memory when compared to consoles, the entirety of what Hiroyuki and Shugo Takahashi had envisioned ended up being cut into two separate titles. It would make sense seeing as how Shining Force 3 was divided into 3 separate volumes that covered specific groups within the game's overall story, so Camelot gave in and decided to do just that. For their first game, it would focus on the side of the protagonists, while their next game would focus on the antagonists. By taking this path, The Takahashi Brothers believed that this would end up being the only effective way of conveying the full story of a fictional game world. After all the structures they went through during this development process, the finished build was described as a testament to the positive results a long development cycle can bring to a game instead of a shorter one. In August 2000, Camelot showed off an early but playable build of Golden Sun at the Nintendo Space World Expo in Japan. Before the game was officially released in the West, North American critics were able to get their hands on it, with certain publications saying that the experience with developing Shining Force aided the developer in creating a gripping RPG for a handheld. With Golden Sun still a JRPG that was brand new and amongst a niche crowd who never knew of its existence, the game had little marketing from Nintendo, although commercials were produced for both the Japanese and North American markets during their release. Golden Sun would finally release in Japan on August 1st, 2001, North America on November 11th, 2001, and Europe on February 22nd of the following year. Golden Sun's setting hails from a fantasy world known as Weyard, a massive Earth-like environment with several major continents and oceans. However, the whole world would not be the major premise of this game, as its setting would revolve around two of the largest continents within Weyard's central region, Angara to the north, and Gondowan to the south. Weyard as a whole is governed by the four elements of nature: earth, fire, wind, and water, and each element is in respective alignment with the four planets: Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Mercury. These building blocks of reality can be manipulated by the omnipotent force of alchemy, which had reigned supreme in the world's history. Alchemy was sealed away in the past because of its unworldly power, and Weyard in the present age has become seemingly devoid of it. Ironically, people from various locations throughout the world can demonstrate an aptitude to manipulate one of the elements through the form of magic that is known as synergy. The people who can wield its incredible power are referred to as adepts, but they tend to refrain from showing their talents by those who don't understand. Golden Sun's heroes would consist of the 17-year-old Venus adept named Isaac, who would be this game's main character and silent protagonist. He is a young squire who resides from a village known as Vale, where the secrets of alchemy and the pure power of the four elements are guarded by the village where everyone is considered as adepts. Joining Isaac would be his 17-year-old childhood friend and closest companion named Garrett, who is an adept that is in the alignment of Mars, a 15-year-old boy named Ivan, who is from a merchant town known as Calais and an adept to the alignment of Jupiter, and a 16-year-old girl named Mia, who hails from the northern winter town of Imil and an adept in alignment to Mercury. Other characters present would be a 17-year-old girl named Jenna, who is both Isaac and Garrett's childhood friend, as well as being aligned to the power of Mars, and an old man named Creighton, who is a scholar that has been studying the powers of alchemy that reside within the village of Vale. Amongst the primary antagonists are Saturos and Minardi, a pair of immensely powerful and talented Mars adepts through a foreign race from the north that is ancient to everyone. Within their party are a powerful and mysterious Mercury adept named Alex, who is from within the same heritage as Mia, and a boy named Felix, who turns out to be Jenna's 18-year-old brother that is indebted to the antagonists for saving his life. Various side characters and non-playable characters have a relation to the plot, but the cast is just as colorful and full of personality, like what one would expect for a Japanese role-playing game, with Golden Sun being no exception. Members of the development team would consist of Shugo Takahashi as the director and one of the producers of the project, while Hiroyuki Takahashi would be a producer, game planner, and scenario writer. Other members would include Shinji Hatano being another producer for the game, Fumihide Aoki as the main art director, while Shin Yamanouchi would be in charge of the character designs, and the soundtrack would be composed by Hiroyuki and Shugo Takahashi's longtime friend, Motoi Sakuraba, a freelance music composer who is well known for working on the soundtracks for the Tales series by Bandai Namco, the Star Ocean games for both Tri-Ace and Square Enix, and his most famous work is that of the Dark Souls games that are developed by From Software and also put out by Bandai Namco to this day. The prevalent force of alchemy in Weyard's ancient past enabled the development of great civilizations. However, this thriving period eventually gave way to a worldwide conflict, where those started to abuse that same power for their own personal gain, only for alchemy to be sealed away as penance so that no one would have to repeat that same mistake. The keys to unlock the power of alchemy, the four elemental stars which keep the full power of the four elements in check, end up being stored within the mountain shrine of Mount Aleph, which in turn would be guarded by the residents of a village from the mountain's base called Vale. Even though that power would be sealed away within the mountain shrine, there are those who wish to unlock alchemy once more. A prologue within Golden Sun occurs with the mountain town of Vale being struck by a thunderstorm and threatened to be damaged by an oncoming rockslide. The people within the village work diligently to thwart the forces of nature that are about to scar their home, but they weren't strong enough to subdue it all, as the oncoming rockslide was way too powerful and destroyed most of the village, along with taking the lives of Isaac's father and Jenna's brother Felix along with their parents. Isaac and Garrett stumble across a pair of powerful warriors who turn out to be the ones who mysteriously caused the magical storm and rockslide, only for them to be knocked out in silence. 3 years later, Isaac, Garrett, and Jenna train in the art of using Synergy so that they can be more powerful to make up for their failings from the past, and they join their teacher named Creighton on a hiking expedition through the Soul Sanctum to discover the 4 elemental stars at the mountain's peak. Their research coincides with a second raid of the Sanctum by the mysterious warriors from the past who turned out to be Saturos and Minardi of the Mars clan from the north, and they are accompanied by 2 other companions who take Jenna and Creighton hostage by coercing Isaac and Garrett to give them 3 out of the 4 elemental stars they collected. Those companions joining the Mars clansmen would be a Mercury adept named Alex and a Venus adept named Felix, who turns out to be Jenna's older brother and is alive and well. Unfortunately, the raiding party's attempt at retrieving the 4th elemental star that Isaac secures goes sour, as a volcanic eruption happens with the Marauders escaping with the hostages as their bargaining chips. Fortunately for both Isaac and Garrett, they are saved by the guardian of Mount Aleph, a Cyclops boulder known as the Wise One, who entrusts them to seek out elemental creatures called the Gene and stop Saturos' group from activating all of the lighthouse beacons that require the elemental stars, or else Alchemy will be restored and Weyard's period of instability will begin anew. Being exiled from their village to undertake this task, Isaac and Garrett eventually meet up with a boy named Ivan and a girl named Mia, as they are all tasked with catching up to Saturos and Minardi's group to stop them from achieving their goal. Golden Sun's gameplay is that of a traditional Japanese role-playing game that is turn-based, but the game has its own innovations to add originality to the genre. The basics amongst movement can have players moving around in 8 different directions, as Golden Sun is more played from the perspective of an aerial bird's-eye view. Much of the time spent within the fields take place in dungeons, caves, towns, and other locales that often feature puzzles integrated into their layout. Puzzle solving within the fields require the player to perform a variety of actions, like creating makeshift bridges by pushing logs into rivers, shifting the tracks of a minecart, or even pushing pillars to have them evenly placed one space next to each other to jump over them from their high points to reach new platforms. Jumping over gaps is another benefit, as that ability can be used to reach newer platforms or areas that are not reachable just on foot alone. Many of these puzzles may require players to use the magical force of Synergy, energy in the Japanese version, in solving many of these riddles. Using magic on the fields within Golden Sun becomes a major contrast to many other role-playing games, as magic can only be primarily used within conflict and post-combat healing. Synergy, however, is used in both modes of exploration within the fields and within combat, but the former is crucial when solving many of the conundrums that stall the player's movement. For example, the Whirlwind spell that damages enemies in battle is also used outside of combat to remove overgrown foliage blocking the player's path, and the water spell called Frost can be utilized to freeze puddles of water to create ice pillars for the players to create newer platforms when on the top parts of the puzzle. Synergy comes in the 4 elements of Earth, Fire, Wind, and Water. Venus Synergy is used for the manipulation of rocks and plants. Mars Synergy revolves around fire and heat. Jupiter Synergy is based on wind and electricity, and Mercury Synergy is more concerned on water and ice. Players can also backtrack to certain locations in case they lacked the specific Synergy spells they did not have in their possession from before. One of the other most original features would be the game's gene system, as there are a total of 28 of these magical creatures that players can obtain for the characters to use. There are 7 gene for each element, and each genie has a special purpose for when they are used in battle. When gathering gene within the world map, or the many in-game fields the players traverse themselves in, they can be set to every character to boost their stats by a minimal margin when they have an odd number of them aligned to any character. However, if they have an even number set for a specific character, those characters can have the ability to upgrade into different classes, which will give a stronger boost to their stats, as well as possibly learning new Synergy spells they didn't know they had. This is primarily seen when each character has 7 gene that are aligned to their own element, but having different elemental gene being aligned to specific characters can see a different change to their classes, as well as bestow upon them Synergy spells that are unique to the occupation. The amount of jobs between each number of genes set to every character is huge, and the different types have their own pros and cons depending on the situation. Sometimes a gene will automatically join the protagonist when mostly found in towns and some caves and dungeons, but the latter two areas where players find the different gene may see them end up resisting from joining their cause, and fight them as a result. Defeating them will subdue their resistance and join the protagonists for recognizing their strength. While traveling on the world map, players can enter towns, dungeons, caves, or even enter battles that they can get themselves into. When in towns, players can scavenge through certain objects like pots, stoves, barrels, piles of logs, bookshelves, and such to find hidden items within them that can range from pieces of equipment like weapons and armor to healing items such as herbs and status-curing medicines. Coins can also be found, that is the game's in-game currency. Coins can be used in item shops, weapon shops, and armor shops to purchase and sell the assets within each store. Aside from the normal items, weapons, and pieces of armor that players can purchase, they may become lucky to find artifacts that are on sale for a steep price, but the effects of the items and pieces of equipment become all the more coin essential when trying to obtain those high-tier products. Artifact weapons are mostly stronger than normal weapons, but they have hidden abilities that are executed if that chance were to be passed based on a character's luck. Those hidden abilities are far more powerful than just traditional melee attacks, but the types of attacks are either elemental or status-inducing to turn the tide in conflict. Artifact armor is the same way when it comes to a character's defense, as certain benefits can help the player with protecting them from anything that could possibly be a detriment to them. Artifact items come in the form of revival and higher hit point and synergy point restoration items to the protagonists. Purchasing items, weapons, and armor aren't the only use of coins, as sanctums are just as important if an issue were to arise. Sanctums are used as a means for a recovery point if the protagonist were to be defeated in battle, but the priests of each temple can grant players the opportunity to revive certain characters who have fallen in battle, remove spirits that haunt them and hurt them if any character is induced with one in combat, remove curses that may be embedded in certain weapons and armor that can severely hurt a character, as well as not being able to remove the equipment at their own free will, and to cure poison if a character is afflicted with that physical ailment. If a character befalls under any negative concoction such as death, poison, being haunted, or being cursed, they can go into the sanctums to relieve them from those predicaments, but at a price. Just like any role-playing game, whether it be from a Western or Japanese approach, fighting monsters and bosses becomes just as important to the player if they wish to press onward in their adventure. In any normal tradition, random battles will usually take place in a dungeon, cave, labyrinth, or on the world map. As players walk around the specified areas where monsters are present and roaming about, they will all of a sudden be thrown into conflict where the goal is to stay alive and win the fight. Most of the enemies are that of what most would expect in an RPG that is fantasy-based. Those like wolves, goblins, orcs, manticores, chimeras, wyverns, bugs, bandits, warriors, and such are very commonplace within Golden Sun, and the different regions have different kinds within those varieties, as one can be much stronger with a palette swap. While fighting in a battle, players are given the privilege to give primary commands at the start of the fight. Those primary commands are that of fight, which will have the player giving the character secondary commands to win in a battle, flee to run away if the players can based on their character's levels and stats, and status to check on the character's stats and conditions they are at while in this mode. If players stand their ground and fight, they have a list of secondary commands they can give to each character at their own expense. Attack will see characters using melee-based weapons with their own weapons on enemies, or possibly utilizing the special abilities from artifact weapons they have equipped. Defend will have a character protecting themselves from oncoming physical and magical attacks from enemies. Synergy will give the character the opportunity to use magic-based spells that can help them offensively or defensively in a fight. And items will allow players to use an item that is amongst their own inventories. As Gene can be a benefit to a character to increasing their stats and jobs when outside of battle, they can also be used in battle. Using the Gene command will have a character take advantage of whatever genie they have at their disposal to be offensive or defensive based on their own purposes. After they are used, they will add up to the number of different gene that each character utilized during and after battle, and they can be individually used or combined together to become a summon. Summons will have the character use this command to unleash a powerful attack from a phantom beast of unworldly proportions, and their use can increase the strength of a character's affinity to any element they used in that command. That way, their synergy spells and summons will be much stronger to execute than the first time around. After each summon is executed, the gene will need a set number of turns to rest, and be ready to be set back onto the character that they are attached to. That way, players can repeat the process if they wish to do so once more. As the challenge continues to grow with every battle that is in place, using these two commands can greatly shift the tide into the player's favor, so that they won't feel like they have been underpowered in the latter parts of the journey. Even though Gene can be used in battle and to ready themselves to become used as summons, players can deactivate their set Genie or Gene outside of conflict so that they can use whatever preferred summon they want at the beginning of any oncoming battle that is to ensue. After winning every battle, players are granted experience points to every character they have available so that they can grind their levels for stronger stats, and possibly learn new synergy spells when meeting a certain level. Most of the spells are original, but there are some that can be upgraded into stronger forms of that base spell. Earning coins and some items after battle also comes into play. After battle, characters who use up hit points and synergy points must recover in some way, so that they'll need to be at full strength for the next possible encounter. Using healing items and synergy spells with healing properties can restore a character's hit points at the cost of synergy points, but synergy points can also be restored by coming into contact with purple crystalline objects called synergy stones to fully restore every party member's magic point system. If no synergy stone is present, walking around on whatever field the player is in can slowly restore a character's synergy points too. Walking in a hazardous zone and the world map can also restore a character's set of Gene to full strength after they have been used at the end of a battle as well. Going through each random encounter is just as important to help a player's party become much stronger to overcome future adversaries and obstacles, but boss battles become just as important to progress even further. Boss battles are story-based conflicts that are needed for the player to continue on from where they are currently at, or else they'll end up being chopped liver and taken back to whatever sanctum is the closest to that particular area they are in. If players wanted more of a challenge, they can locate the Crossbone Isle and traverse in a 10-story cave with going through various puzzles to obtain items and fight bosses on each floor they are trying to pass from one to the other. The most experienced players who succeed in reaching the bottom where an abandoned ship is located can have access to facing against the game's most challenging super boss, Deadbeard. Golden Sun became an impressive staple amongst Nintendo's growing catalog of intellectual properties, as the game would go on to receive critical acclaim upon release. Many who praised the game were marveled by the game's graphics, as they found that the presentation was a shining jewel for a platform that became a revival for 16-bit games that were once part of the Super Nintendo's lifespan. Even though that same visual style was used for Shining Force 3 on the Sega Saturn, it would have amazed many Super Nintendo owners back in the day if a game like this would have been made for that platform. The game's sound also received so much attention, as some would even go as far to say that Golden Sun's soundtrack has become one of Motoi Sakuraba's best for any game on any platform he was a part of, as they deemed it incredible and cinematic to the overall product. Even the varied yet refined gameplay was very noteworthy amongst the game's praise, as many would say that the puzzle solving, battle mode, and gene system would come off being the game's strongest suits, as they found everything within those three categories to be huge, fantastic, creative, and very addicting that would easily grasp those who enjoy role-playing games of any franchise they would play. However, Golden Sun did garner some criticism, as many felt that the perceived overuse of text dialogue in the game's cutscenes would be a detriment to its overall flow, but this was primarily directed towards the prologue section of the game. Other cutscenes were also attributed to this fault, but mostly weren't a hindrance to the overall pacing of the plot. Speaking of the plot, some called it being cliched at every angle, as the mini-games that use the four elements as a staple basis for the plot is pretty much every game trying to achieve the same level of recognition that Final Fantasy managed to do when it conceived that idea for the first game in 1987. While its overall story and characters were praised to a certain context, the dialogue came off feeling very basic and hardly even strong in delivery, as every character felt like their communication came off feeling very elementary instead of being grand in its word choice. Plus, the overuse of choosing yes and no answers when specific questions would be brought up during the plot did not have any significant effect to latter parts of the story. Even though the battles in the game were some of the game's strongest qualities, they were also some of the game's biggest shortcomings. Mostly this was aimed at typical random battle encounter mechanics that were present in many other role-playing games, and the fact that characters can attack a different enemy if their targeted foe to attack is already defeated by another ally. Aside from the criticisms that were to be had within the game, Golden Sun still reigned supreme when it released to a worldwide audience, as the game would go on to sell nearly 2 million copies to this day, as most of the sales were attributed to the North American audience. It would receive numerous accolades, such as receiving the Nintendo Power Award for Best Game Boy Advance Game of the Year in 2001, being ranked 94 in IGN's Reader's Choice Top 100 Games Ever, and eventually named the 24th Best Game Boy Advance Game in the website's feature reflecting the platform's long lifespan. It would even be rated the 31st best game made on a Nintendo system in Nintendo Power's Top 200 Games list. Golden Sun's delivery left a very powerful impact on those who were looking for something new during the times of the Golden Age of JRPGs, and its addition to Nintendo's growing list of intellectual properties was nothing to sneeze at. Although Pokemon was the primary RPG franchise for Nintendo, some thought that Golden Sun would be enough to be warranted as a companion who could possibly do just as well as its contemporaries. Even though it was noted to those that the whole story for Golden Sun was to be divided into 2 games to complete the entire saga, those who didn't know about that were very surprised that the first game would end off with a cliffhanger that came out of nowhere, as they suspect that Isaac and his party would consist of the game's main heroes. This lasting impression made them believe that Golden Sun came off being incomplete, and rightfully so to that context, but it would be inevitable that a new installment would be made to finish the entire story. At the end of Golden Sun, Isaac and his companions succeeded in slaying Satoros and Minardi at the top of the Venus Lighthouse at the easternmost tip of the Gondoan continent. However, they could not stop them from igniting the lighthouse before their deaths. They would be granted a boat to sail the vast waters of the ocean to search for Felix, Jenna, Kraden, Alex, and a girl named Sheba who was abducted by Satoros and Minardi have left Gondoan and started drifting out into the sea. At that point, when the heroes leave, and the whereabouts of Felix and his party are unknown to the party and the player, the game abruptly ends on a cliffhanger, as the events of the Jupiter and Mars lighthouses wouldn't be told until the inevitable sequel was to arrive. In the meantime, extra content was made available to those who wanted to test their skills against stronger versions of monsters and bosses, as well as going toe-to-toe with other players via the Game Boy Advance's link cable in the game's battle mode. The link cable battles serve as a hub where players can fight against each other to see who would be the strongest and most strategic in their friendly conflicts. The main story and battle modes would be the most used sections of Golden Sun, but players who pressed random buttons within the opening menu would also come across a new option called Send with the picture of an envelope. People were unsure what this feature would be used for, as it gave off a password and link system for them to transfer their data to another source. For those who beat the game and experienced the cliffhanger ending, they speculated that the end result of what they pulled off for the game could be transferred into the next game so that Isaac and his party can retain their stats, items, equipment, and all the gene they obtained during the first journey. Ironically, that would be the case, as development for the sequel was definitely underway. After Golden Sun was completed, development for the next game was certainly in the works for the Takahashi Brothers and Camelot Software Planning, while they continued to contribute games within the golf and tennis installments of the Mario sports titles. The next game was tentatively going to be called Golden Sun 2 during its creation, but seeing as how the original game had the subtitle The Broken Seal in Japan, it was opted in for the next game to have a subtitle instead of just being called Golden Sun 2. Ergo, the game would instead be named as Golden Sun: The Lost Age. The Lost Age was first revealed to Japan in early 2002, as Famitsu would be the first publication to review the game. The new game would not have Isaac and his party returning as the game's central protagonists, as it would focus on a new set of protagonists who would originate on the side of the traveling companions toward Satoros and Minardi's crew. Felix, Jenna, and the Wind Adept from the end of the first game named Sheba would be amongst the playable party, as their own journey would pick up after the first game ended, thus with more of the world of Wayard being expanded upon than being stuck on the continents of Angara and Gondoan. Even after its reveal in Japan, hype was already starting to build during that year, as it even topped IGN's list of Game Boy Advance Most Wanted titles for 2003, since it was slated for a Western release in that time period. North America was even more fortunate to get a playable demo of The Lost Age, as the game would be playable at the 2002 Electronic Entertainment Expo, and various publications even reported that the opening of the game did away with the notoriously boring prologue done in the first game, and did an introductory backstory of what all happened in the first game, just to get those who did not play that game to be caught up with what all was going on. Even those who previewed the game would go as far to say that the game built upon the graphics engine seen in its predecessor, as the color scheme was more rich and crisp. Certain sprites such as Felix and Sheba would be updated since they were now amongst the playable party, and certain fauna such as birds flying would add more attention to detail to the activity of all living things in certain environments. As Golden Sun took roughly 18 months to complete, The Lost Age didn't take that much longer, as it was completed and finished within less than a year. Golden Sun The Lost Age would see a release in Japan on June 28, 2002, April 14, 2003 for North America, and September 19, 2003 for all residents in Europe. Golden Sun The Lost Age continues on in the world of Weyard, but more of its geography is expanded from what was seen in its predecessor. Weyard has an actual representation of what the whole world is supposed to be, as it is based on the Flat Earth concept. The Flat Earth concept within Weyard is a flat, roughly elliptical plane, whose oceans perpetually spill off the edge of the world's perimeter into an endless abyss. What is beyond and over the abyss, no one really knows. Instead of Angara being a playable region, several new continents and islands are present to explore. Those continents are that of Indra, Oceania, Hesperia, Ateca, and Tundaria, with smaller landmasses that consist of the northern reaches, Lemuria, Apogee Islands, Treasure Island, Cult Island, and a number of islets around the seas. Gondoan returns as a traversable continent, but the area that is traversable is the far south, where everything is based on jungles instead of the desert seen in the first game, as that region was more of the continent's northern tip. When looking at the different continents and islands within the world of Weyard, they bear a strong resemblance to the many different cultures and ideologies to that of the real world. Angara bears similarities to that of Europe, continental Eastern Asia, and the Near East. Gondoan bears more of a resemblance to that of Africa to the south and the Middle East to the north. Indra is more to that of India. Oceania is similar to Oceania in Australia. Hesperia resembles North America because of its Native American tribes. Ateca is more like South America, and the northern continent of Tundaria plays out more like the Arctic or Antarctic. Several of the islands and islets are based on real-world locations as well. The game stars Felix as the game's central lead character, who originally came from the side of the antagonist group that was led by the late Satoru Minardi. As Felix spoke in dialogue from the last game, he is now the game's new silent protagonist. Felix is an 18-year-old boy who is another squire and a Venus adept much like Isaac. He is joined by his 17-year-old sister Jenna, who is a flame user for the alignment of Mars that is a cross between an offensive and defensive magic user like Mia in the previous game, but equips weapons like Ivan when it comes to staves and small swords. Amongst the Jupiter adept is a 14-year-old girl named Shiba, who is very similar to Ivan in his job class, and she was originally captured by Satoru Minardi and Golden Sun for their own purpose in reigniting the lighthouses. On the side of the Mercury clan, joining Felix would be a mysterious and stoic mariner from the hidden kingdom of Lemuria who goes by the name of Piers. Creighton would return with a much bigger role since he is mainly stuck in Felix's crew. Since Satoru and Minardi were slain by Isaac and his group, taking up their roles would also hail from the Mars clan from Tundaria in the town of Prox to the far north. These beings would be Agatio and Karst, where their roles are very similar to that of their predecessors when it comes to their fight styles and personalities. Alex from the Mercury clan would return once more, as his objectives remain secretive, but all in the same, as he is the one who truly craves for the power of the Golden Sun to obtain unworldly power and immortality. Finally, the protagonist from the game before that consists of Isaac, Garrett, Ivan, and Mia would also return, but the biggest surprise is that they become playable allies at around 75% of the story's completion, boosting the number of playable protagonists to 8 instead of 4. Instead of playing in the perspective that a group must stop another from doing something that could potentially be catastrophic, this new group would continue igniting the lighthouses as Weyard is already in decline, with alchemy not being used to keep the world from collapsing into the endless abyss. On top of which, Felix and Jenna's parents, as well as Isaac's father, are held as bargaining chips in Prox, alive and well, since they all did not perish during the events of the Prologue in the first game. The number of non-playable characters that are relevant to the story is just as massive as the first game, but many of the ones who were in the first game don't return, as some do, while most others are briefly mentioned in the story. All the members of the development team for the first Golden Sun would reprise their development roles for the sequel. Picking up after the first game ended, Felix and his group traveled to new land outside of both Angara and Gondoan to continue their mission in igniting the 2 remaining lighthouses so that Weyard can thrive with life once more, and that their parents are granted their freedom based on their cooperation. Going through several trials and tribulations throughout the eastern portion of Weyard, such as recruiting help from peers by gaining a boat to sail the sea and entering the ancient kingdom of Lemuria that is surrounded by thick clouds, they eventually make way to the western part of the world to continue their mission, as well as meeting up with Isaac and his group, and explaining to them the importance of why their quest must be completed, prompting him and his own party to join Felix in his cause. Much of the fundamentals that are seen from the first game are brought back in full force for the Lost Age, but it has some new features and mechanics to boot. Everything with traveling on the world map, towns, dungeons, caves, labyrinths, forests and such retain a strong presence, but the newest travel on the world map came in the form of sailing by a Lemurian ship that is piloted by peers. Traveling the vast oceans of Weyard can help Felix and his party discover new locations that can't be reached on foot, and several islands and islets help add in more playable areas for players to discover. While sailing in the water, random battles are prone to happen much like when traveling on foot through land. The only downside is that no Djinn are out in the sea, as they are mostly on areas of land. After meeting up with Isaac and having him and his party join together with Felix and his own crew, the Lemurian ship will be granted wings so that the boat can actually fly in the air, with the use of each character's synergy points to act as fuel. The puzzles in the different areas of exploration are mostly the same, with their own creative twists, but newer types and newer synergy spells add more than what was seen within the fields in the enemy and boss encounters. Djinn return in this game, but the total number is increased by 72 instead of 28 this time around. With the more Djinn available to obtain, can bring about newer opportunities for a much stronger job and more combinations for different jobs not seen in the first game. On top of all the summons that players can use from the first game into the Lost Age, a new feature to summons comes into play with summon tablets. Summon tablets can be found in secret caves and dungeons that will grant players the ability to summon beasts that use up a combination of different elements instead of just one type. This will allow characters who summon these monsters that use different elements to increase the strength of not only their preferred element, but that of another as well. As the battle mode makes a comeback from the previous game, a new feature added would be a secret sound test when talking to one of the non-playable characters in the lobby, and players can listen to the tunes of all the music tracks that were composed between both games. Another new addition to the random enemy and boss battles is that players can swap between different characters when all 8 of them come together near the end. Each character will be given the opportunity to set 9 Djinn between themselves instead of only being restricted to 7 for each. The only true way to grant players the opportunity to having 72 Djinn in their party is to take advantage of the data transfer option from the first game into the Lost Age, making the send function of the first game now serve its purpose in the sequel. When transferring the data from the first game to the next, players can link both games to 2 Game Boy Advances via the Game Boy Advance link cable to make it easy in transferring all of the data from that game into the other. However, if they are unable to do so, they are given the opportunity to insert a password under 3 different tiers to determine which items, equipment, money, key items, and Djinn they want to transfer from one game to the other. The bronze tier will transfer all character levels, Djinn, and quest data from the first game to the sequel. The silver tier will transfer everything mentioned from before, but also the character stats from the first game to the sequel, and the gold tier will transfer everything from the bronze and silver tiers, but include all the items and coins that were part of Isaac and Company's inventories from the first game to the sequel. Doing this would not only have everything set in stone for Isaac and his party when they are recruited, but certain events that are completed in the first game can have special events happen in the sequel after completing the data transfer. Doing this will showcase bonus scenes with different occurrences happening, as some of them can grant Felix and his allies exclusive bonus equipment that come off being some of the best to have for any character. For obtaining all 72 Djinn in the game, players will be granted access to a bonus dungeon to obtain the 2 strongest summon tablets, as well as a super boss fight against the deadliest of them all, Dullahan. Golden Sun: The Lost Age received a very strong and very positive reception, just like its predecessor from critics and its dedicated fans, but it left many debating to whether or not the game was superior or inferior to the first installment they played a little over a year ago. When it came to the game's overall praise, they were happy that all the mechanics remained unchanged, but its additions, along with the plethora of more complicated puzzles, were welcomed for those who enjoyed the first game. The newest approach of the game, playing out more of a non-linear experience instead of a straightforward one, was a new challenge that many felt to be welcomed for those who were looking for something new, and the rewards for when transferring data from the first game into the next only made it more appealing for those who craved for those little extras. The refinements and polishing of a much cleaner and more vibrant color palette made the graphics look possibly far more impressive than what was seen in the first game, and the music by Motoi Sakuraba continued to impress those who were awaiting whatever new he could come up with for the series. In terms of the criticisms that were to be had with The Lost Age, many of the complaints they found from the original game, including the combat system, were back and not addressed as many would have hoped for. They felt that even though the challenge was still there and possibly more engaging than the first game, the incongruous nature of smart combat when battling enemies still remained unchanged. Mostly, this dealt with the continued fault of characters not attacking new targets after their preferred target is already slain by another party member, making the combat refrain from continuing the motion within that mode. Even though the game's attention toward a more non-linear nature was something that many praised the game for, many others were critical of this feature as it meant that various locations had to be revisited to move the story forward, and for any progression to actually take place. Thus, backtracking from place to place became a tedious chore, as seeing as how much bigger Weird with its scope was. Plus, the random battles when traveling on ship would prove tiring to most players. There were even those who would say that the game's graphics were one of the only elements that set the fighting system above typical RPG fare. Many who were expecting more came off feeling somewhat underwhelmed, as they thought that Camelot could have added more features, refined the writing and make it more grand, instead of making everyone continue to sound elementary in their speeches, and criticized the Lost Age long opening sequence, which either alienated players of the previous game or confused newer players by swapping them with unfamiliar locales and characters they didn't even know from before. Aside from other criticisms that were to be had with the game, critics and fans of the original Golden Sun came to the consensus that the Lost Age has enough of its own merits to stand on its own, and being truly worthy of a continuation to something they enjoyed in the past. Even the ending for Golden Sun The Lost Age brought complete and great closure to what the Takahashi Brothers wanted to achieve. Golden Sun The Lost Age managed to sell over 1 million copies worldwide, with most of its sales once again being attributed to its North American audience. Conversely, The Lost Age ended up being ranked 78 on IGN's Reader's Choice Top 100 Games Ever, higher than its predecessor, and it became the 69th best game made on a Nintendo system in Nintendo Power's Top 200 Games list. After the release of Golden Sun The Lost Age, Hiroyuki Takahashi felt that he, his brother, and the team were burned out after working on such a big project like the first two games, as they were originally meant to be conceived as one title, and that they decided to take a break from working on any newer entries by continuing their work on the golf and tennis lineup of Mario sports titles for Nintendo. Even though they decided to forego working on a new Golden Sun and chose to work on more Mario Golf and Mario Tennis games for Nintendo, including We Love Golf for the Wii by Capcom, talk of a third game in the Golden Sun series was bound to be inevitable. Talk of a third game in the franchise began as soon as The Lost Age was released in 2002 in Japan. In 2003, Camelot stated to the press and to fans that the current status of a third game is still up in the air for the developer, while the Takahashi Brothers stated in a 2004 interview that the scenarios for the first two games were intended as quote-unquote prologues to the real event yet to come. For that kind of statement, this left many to speculate that they were possibly going to take the series to a whole new level, and have a much bigger game to be placed on the home console front instead of the portable handhelds, as speculation began to brew that the third title might surface on the Nintendo GameCube. However, no game came on that system for the rest of its life cycle, and no third game would ever arrive onto its successor, the Nintendo Wii. Speculation persisted throughout the years after both Golden Sun and The Lost Age were released, and some thought that a new game would eventually arrive on the Nintendo DS, since it came out sometime after The Lost Age was released, setting in the motion of next-generation portable gaming. This too did not stop those who were wanting a third Golden Sun to officially happen. Hoaxes began to spread in the absence of reports about a third game wasn't being made public, and two of these hoaxes would make headway during the Wii and Nintendo DS's life cycle. The first of these hoaxes came about when a false rumor showcased a fake Nintendo DS screenshot of a Golden Sun 3 title screen. It would feature a false title on the top screen along with its subtitle, as this fake third game would be titled Golden Sun: Alex's Road, with a mysterious lighthouse in the background. On the bottom screen, it showcased that the data from within Golden Sun: The Lost Age could be transferred into this supposed game so that the features could play out like the first game into the sequel for bonus content, as it would have been possible to transfer from a Game Boy Advance cartridge to a Nintendo DS cartridge. Some came to the idea that this new game would be based on everything from Alex's point of view and what his actual goals were about, since they were vague but noticeable at the end of The Lost Age. However, inconsistencies were bound from the screenshot, as many figured out that the still image was a hoax to begin with. The two big giveaways were that Alex's name was spelled as Arexu in-game, and that the Lost Age's Game Boy Advance cartridge was based on the North American release instead of the Japanese one that had a golden light brown background. Even though the rumor was squashed without mercy, it wouldn't be the only false rumor to occur, as the second one was more clever. This second hoax would make waves on July 11th, 2007 on the recently defunct Joystick.com concerning their E3 special coverage. John Bardinelli from within the former publication wrote an article that someone identified under the alias Gobo_4227 stated that Nintendo held a small pre-E3 gathering to test a small handful of Wii and Nintendo DS titles that were not scheduled to be shown off at the event. One of these games that was not supposed to be shown was for a new Golden Sun game that would be making leeway onto the Nintendo DS after a 4 to 5 year hiatus, and this third game would be known as Golden Sun: The Solar Soothsayer. Development for this title was very early, and the story's premise would take place where the previous games left off, and that Felix would return as the main protagonist in a pseudo-3D world, with gameplay and controls very similar to that of Animal Crossing DS. Gobo_4227 managed to take screenshots of this prototype with his cell phone that depicted what the title screen was going to be like, but there were those who were immediately thrown in doubt towards the build's authenticity. For starters, the opening screen was localized in English, as the first two installments were released in Japanese first, before localization to a Western release of both games would begin, making it even more strange to see an English version before Japanese. The next inconsistency would be that the Nintendo/Camelot line of both companies' credit in making this game would have the copyright mark omitted, as prior entries had that placed on that line. Even though the logo on the top screen looked authentic enough to be deemed original, the bottom screen's picture reused official art that was taken from Golden Sun: The Lost Age, as it was deemed unlikely that Camelot would reuse assets they made many years ago into newer content instead. As more and more users were decrying the pictures as part of a hoax and not real, Gobo_4227 would surface as a new alias named Opium and has admitted that the pictures were indeed fake. His reasoning in creating the images and conceiving the story was an attempt to stir up conversation among many of the forums dedicated to the franchise, with the hope of causing Camelot Software Planning to be aware that the popularity of the original games were still strong, and the demand for a new game was right now. Long after the latest hoax has been known for quite some time, Hiroyuki Takahashi claimed that the premise of the Solar Soothsayer sounded really cool and would love to see how something like that would turn out. Speculation on a potential third game in the Golden Sun franchise still loomed in the air, even after the hoaxes were brought about online. In spite of all of this, the Takahashi Brothers commented in October 2007 that they still want to make a third game, going as far as to say that they quote-unquote have to, and that Nintendo had requested them to make another. If they wanted to make a new game to surpass what was established in the Game Boy Advance titles, it would need to have the correct and proper development time it deserves. In April 2008, Nintendo Power Magazine interviewed Shugo Takahashi on one of his latest games. When he was questioned about the regards of there being a third Golden Sun, his enigmatic response came off as, "A new Golden Sun? Well, I personally think that I want to play a new RPG too." Whether if this meant that a new game was indeed in development or that something new was being conceived, Shugo Takahashi's latter comment came off being pretty vague. The rest of the year, and most of the first half of the next year, left many holding out on hope for there to be a new Golden Sun game to make the light of day, since no news of there being a follow-up has been made for 6 years after The Lost Age's release. By the time when June 2009 rolled out, with E3 happening within that month, Nintendo formally announced that the development of a third installment to the Golden Sun series was indeed happening, as it was slated for release on the Nintendo DS within the 2010 holiday season.
And before we leave the RPG category, there's one more piece of important news. A legendary RPG name is on its way back to Nintendo Portables, a franchise that's been gone for quite a while. After going dark 6 years ago, 2010 will bring a new dawn with Golden Sun DS.
It would be tentatively titled Golden Sun DS, and no more updates about the game's development would be made until E3 2010 during Nintendo's press conference. It was there that the final name of the game would be referred to as Golden Sun Dark Dawn, and a trailer showed off the gameplay within field travel and battle sequences, as a playable demo was made available to attendees at the event. During the July 2010 edition of Weekly Famitsu, Shugo Takahashi stated that unlike its predecessors, this entry would be an independent work. For some, this would mean that the story would not pick up immediately after the first two games, as it looked like the development team wanted to start things fresh, hit a reset button, and work on a new story from that point forward. Hiroyuki Takahashi commented on the unnaturally long development cycle of the Golden Sun games due to their large background and storyline when compared to the company's prior outings in the Shining series. As stated from before, the Takahashi Brothers and their team who worked on the Golden Sun games from the Game Boy Advance were burned out from immediately working on a new entry, and that everyone within the team needed to cool down and work on other projects before they could begin on Dark Dawn with the intent of creating a game with fresh feelings. But part of that couldn't be farther from the truth. After both the Game Boy Advance games of the Golden Sun series were completed, several employees left Camelot to seek other ventures elsewhere, so any new employees who came in and were hired made both the Takahashi brothers felt that their newest members amongst the veterans were not ready to tackle that kind of a challenge. On how they came up with the idea for Dark Dawn, Hiroyuki Takahashi commented on the idea to make this new installment on the DS was based on the fact that he ended up drinking a lot of liquor at a party. When development for the game finally commenced, Camelot's development team was much bigger than the Game Boy Advance iterations, as the resources and development costs for the Nintendo DS were much bigger than that of its predecessor, but having a much larger team helped realize the potential of having a much richer delivery, as the team would often visit various World Heritage sites by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization to help influence and develop the game's overall tale. Golden Sun Dark Dawn did not have that much marketing attached to the game just like its predecessors, but since the popularity in the Western world was much stronger than that of Japan, it was enough that general interest was still there. After over 7 years of a long waiting period, Golden Sun Dark Dawn would finally release in Japan on October 28, 2010, North America on November 29, 2010, and December 2nd and December 10th for both Australia and Europe respectively. Dark Dawn continues with the same setting that was seen in its predecessors on the Game Boy Advance, as the game would once again be set in the thriving world of Weyard. After Alchemy was restored, it became the world's source of power for creating civilization, reviving ones that were lost in the deep abyss past the waterfalls throughout the edge of the world, and for destroying the world itself with many of the elements attributing to its change. Thanks to the efforts of Isaac, Felix, and their parties in saving Weyard, the seal that contained the true power of alchemy at Mount Aleph was removed, so that the whole world could flourish with change that could hopefully be for the benefit of mankind. The power of alchemy, in the form of the Golden Sun, began to restore the declining world, because of the actions from the likes of Isaac, Garrett, Ivan, Mia, Felix, Jenna, Sheba, and Piers. The heroes are viewed as a controversial group, as they are praised for saving the world from decline, as well as criticized for the radical changes that are happening within Weyard. The group is known throughout the world as the Warriors of Vale, and the revival of the power of alchemy has been referred to as the Golden Sun event. Everyone begins to move on with their lives as Isaac and Jenna eventually marry and have a child together. However, they don't stay close with each other, as Isaac and Garrett take refuge on the Goma Plateau with their respective children, while Jenna and the rest of Vale's survivors seek sanctuary in Calais with Ivan, as he has a daughter of his own. Mia returns to Aimil and has 2 children she gave birth to, while Piers continues to travel throughout the seas in Weyard after he was banished from his home kingdom of Lemuria. Surprisingly, both Felix and Sheba disappeared without a trace, as Felix left his home after the Golden Sun event and has not been seen ever since. Rumor has it that he and Sheba may have departed from their homes to be married to each other, as many of those characters wouldn't be around to keep watch of the Golden Sun being above the sunken Mount Aleph. An after effect of this phenomenon has triggered synergy vortexes, distortions in space that suck the elemental energy out of the world and from a depths in their vicinity, and these catastrophic anomalies happen once every 10 years. Isaac and Garrett remain on the Goma Plateau to study the synergy vortexes and other after effects that could possibly happen, as they make it their responsibility that Weyard must continue to be saved after its decline. 30 years would pass that would lead up to the events of Dark Dawn. The Warriors of Vale and Kraden have all showed signs of decelerated aging because of coming into contact with the Golden Sun's power when they were all at the Mars Lighthouse during the Lost Ages climax. During this time span, new continents have emerged, civilization that was lost from the deep abyss outside of Weyard's borders have now been properly restored, and new races have been conceived to make up more of the world's population. Instead of the protagonists of the first two games being at the forefront and center like before, those roles would be carried out by the next generation of heroes, who are the children of the first game's protagonists. Golden Sun Dark Dawn would star a 17-year-old Venus adept known as Matthew, who is the biological son of both Isaac and Jenna, possessing both Isaac's stoic heroic nature and Jenna's determined demeanor respectively. Joining him would be a 17-year-old Mars adept called Tyrell, who is Garrett's son, a 16-year-old Jupiter adept known as Karis, who is Ivan's daughter, and a 15-year-old Mercury adept called Reef, who is Mia's youngest son and has a sister named Noelle, as she is also a Mercury adept. The children of the first game's protagonists would not be the only playable characters, as they are joined by 4 others that hail from different parts of Weyard, with one of them being within a heritage from the many races that were created after the Golden Sun event. A 12-year-old priestess that is aligned with the element of Venus would be a girl called Hime, who is the daughter of a couple who were present during the Lost Age, and they are known as Susa and Kushinada. Another Mars adept would join Matthew and his crew, and that would be a man known as Aeolio, who was a child during the events of the Lost Age, as he is the son of a pirate named Briggs. The second Jupiter adept to be playable in Dark Dawn would be a girl called Sveta, and she would be the only demi-human to join the party, as she hails from one of the many races that were conceived after the Golden Sun event. Finally, the other Mercury adept amongst Matthew's crew would be a boy named Amity, who is the nephew of Mia, and the second cousin of Reef and Noelle, as he would be Alex's son after the events of the Lost Age. Side characters like Kraden would return, whose role is very similar to that of the first 2 games, and Alex would return where his secretive nature would once again come into play, as he wears a mask that is called the Luna Mask to conceal his true identity and go under the codename Arcanus. Amongst the main antagonists would be Blados and Chalice, who are from another new race of humanoid figures who come from a benevolent military nation called Tuaparong. The people of Tuaparong are the first to conceive a new alignment of the elements, as they make up the element of darkness with no alignment to the stars. Another antagonist working alongside Arcanus, Blados and Chalice would be a beastman by the name of Volachek, who is Sveta's brother. The overall setting would revolve around Angara in the Eastern Sea, as traveling the entirety of Weyard is not present for this installment. Everyone from the development team, aside from the producer Shinji Hatano, would reprise their roles in Dark Dawn's development. Succeeding Hatano would be Toshiharu Izuno. Starting off on the Goma Plateau, Isaac and Garrett are stationed within a lookout that is near where Monolith sunk, and where the Golden Sun shines on top of its peak. They stay there along with their respective sons, Matthew and Tyrell, to be on alert for any synergy vortices that may occur, and to make sure that the Wise One is safe from any harm. After being visited by Ivan's daughter Karis, an unfortunate accident happens on their air transportation module, a Soarwing, to where Tyrell wants to try and pilot the device himself, as he believes he can do so on his own. After crash landing outside of the plateau, Matthew, Karis, Isaac, and Garrett go after Tyrell to bring him back to camp along with the already damaged Soarwing. In order for the Soarwing to become operational once more, Isaac and Garrett send Matthew, Karis, and Tyrell to seek out Kraden and his help to locate a feather off of the avian mountain rock swing, while the 2 men stay at the lookout to watch out for any more synergy vortices and other after effects that could happen. Matthew and his friend's quest of retrieving a mountain rock's feather to pilot a Soarwing would only be the prelude to an important journey to save Weyard from a potentially threatening phenomenon that could put the whole world on the brink of eternal darkness. Along the way, they meet up and receive help from the likes of Reef, Amity, Sveta, Aeolio, Hime, and Kraden so they can all prevent an oncoming era of eternal darkness that is about to plague their world. Golden Sun Dark Dawn plays very similarly to its predecessors at almost every angle along the way, but it does have its own additions and refinements to the gameplay. The first thing that many players would notice is that the game ends up going for more of a 3D game with polygonal models and environments, instead of bringing about another 2D game with the graphics engine they implemented during the days of the Game Boy Advance. This would allow for different angled shots between characters to give the story more of a cinematic approach, and the camera can rotate at 360 degrees before, during, and after battle, as everything was polygon based in that mode too. Everything within the different modes of gameplay remains largely unchanged with its travel on the different fields, purchasing items and equipment, utilizing the sanctums to help characters who are in trouble, and fighting enemies and using the gene and summons to help the heroes in doing their bidding. A new feature for the weapons is that every weapon now has a special ability attached to it aside from just the artifact weapons alone. In order to use those special abilities, a character's weapon must be grinded by attacking enemies a set number of times before they are privileged to possibly executing those stronger attacks. Surprisingly, most of the stronger weapons may have more than one special ability that they can learn and unleash within that set arm. When dialogue in the cutscenes happen within the story, there are certain instances where names of certain people, events, synergy spells, and things will pop up in the text that it'll make people select them to either learn about these specific references, learn the mechanics of the game through tutorials, or to learn about the backstory behind the first two installments from nearly a decade prior. The decision-making system of selecting yes and no would receive a facelift, as two more options could be selected if certain circumstances were to happen in a cutscene. Instead, these would come off as different emotions that one can select to give off different expressions during these particular events, such as a happy face to be in agreement, a funny face to think a particular occurrence comes off as really bright, a sad face to present Matthew with a more worried personality, or a mad face to be angry towards certain circumstances. The gene system would also receive an update, as there are 83 gene in total, with only 11 of them being exclusive to both Isaac and Garrett since they are temporary allies in the beginning portions of the game. These 11 gene are ones that appeared in past installments, while there are 11 gene that are brand new in Dark Dawn. Not only that, but most gene would have a different look to their anatomy, so that most of them could differentiate themselves from one another. Their purpose would mostly be the same as the last game, and being set to any character will give them the privilege to increase their stats and change their class if they have the right number set within them. As the battles between random enemies and bosses came off mostly the same from the Lost Age, the most welcomed fix is that each character can target a different enemy if the enemy they choose to attack is defeated by another character, making the flow of battle continue at a faster pace. A few of the towns and some dungeons and caves from the Game Boy Advance titles would come back, but several new areas would come into play due to how the power of alchemy restored lost civilizations and gave birth to new continents and races in the process. If players managed to go through the game and arrive near the end of their journey, they could pursue filler activity to make their party become stronger by looking for gene and summon tablets they missed from before, and to look for bonus dungeons they have not traversed themselves in, but only after they complete the journey. However, backtracking to these past locations would not be an easy cause, as most of the game comes off being far more linear than its predecessors, meaning it would be impossible to backtrack to past locations outright. The main campaign would be the only thing playable, as no battle mode or data transfer from the Lost Age into Dark Dawn was present, as it was most likely because Nintendo's focus on the DS library of systems was that toward both the Nintendo DSi, the Nintendo DSi Lite, and the upcoming Nintendo DSi XL that lacked the Game Boy Advance cartridge slots that the original Nintendo DS and Nintendo DS Lite had. Finally, the summon tablets would return, as they would all be the same like the previous game, but only one new summon would be conceived, as it would be that of a dragon called Crystallix. Crystallix is actually represented as an Easter egg of the Chandelier Dragon featured in the commercial for the first Golden Sun in North America, as the commercial alone had no relevance to the actual plot of that game at the time. Golden Sun Dark Dawn would receive a positive reception upon its release, but faced a very divided audience when it came to its delivery, as it wasn't that highly well received as its predecessors. Dark Dawn continues impressing critics and longtime fans with its graphics, gene system, and the puzzles, as they found the visuals to be a major leap in the franchise's evolution in graphics, the gene system to make both newcomers and veteran RPG fans engaged and not bored with the mechanics, and the puzzles to continue being as intricate and clever as ever, just to get those elusive rewards. Some critics even thought that the transition between 2D to 3D, when transforming the series from its Game Boy Advance days to a new installment on the DS that was more prone to bring about 3D visuals, was accomplished in good effect with Dark Dawn. They even go as far to say that the game's encyclopedia system is very user-friendly for those not familiar with the franchise, as it would help bridge the gap between the Game Boy Advance installments and Dark Dawn if they never played or intended to play the past games at all. However, Dark Dawn ends up with more shortcomings that made many fans and critics believe that this soft reboot came off as more underwhelming than the other games. For many, the first problem that most critics and fans take notice of would be that the difficulty in the random enemy and boss battles came off being more tame and hardly as challenging that the series was well known for. It even didn't help how synergy recharges would happen much quicker, that one can use it liberally in healing in battles without ever having to use a single recovery item, as players will never have to feel stretched of resources whenever they are in a tight spot. Even though some praised the combat system for being more intelligent than its predecessors, they would end up chastising Camelot Software Planning for failing to create combat scenarios that would be suitably difficult to the whole experience, and the only time they did that was only on a few bosses. Because of this, those who criticized the game's difficulty in the combat system thought it came off more as a pushover and never requiring them to brave the combat's depths, making it more apparent that Camelot made this game to appeal more to casuals in mind. The second problem many critics and fans point out for Golden Sun Dark Dawn coming off being a pale entry is that the cutscenes have proven to be much longer with the in-game dialogue. While this problem was present in the Game Boy Advance games that did not hinder the whole experience, it becomes the complete opposite as the amount of dialogue during the cutscenes would double in size to be even more detrimental to the pacing of the entire plot. Mostly, this is based on how the heroes and villains continue to have that uncanny knack for saying the most simple things with about 3 or 4 times the words they actually need to convey certain ideas, making the dialogue sound even more dense while improving upon its word choice. The emotion system when it came to the 4 different emotions during certain circumstances in the cutscenes would end up being completely unnecessary to most people, as the different decisions made based on this system did not really affect the plot at all. If Camelot were to actually do that for this game, it could have paved the way for creating different scenarios and lead to multiple endings, giving off sort of a morality system that hasn't been seen that much in Japanese role-playing games during these recent times. A third major criticism was directed toward the game's more restrictive linear nature. During certain parts of the game, there would come a time when players would not be able to return to some past areas until near the end of the game, if they missed out on a specific genie or a summon tablet they failed to come across. It could have prevented some outcomes that players would face in later portions of the game. The fourth and final thing that most fans came to the consensus to is that they felt that the Takahashi Brothers and Camelot did not really do anything that substantial to make Dark Dawn become just as compelling as the Golden Sun games on the Game Boy Advance, as so many of the assets they saw in those games made a return. The items, equipment, almost all of the gene from before, albeit 11 of them being brand new, the summon tablets were all the same as before, excluding one that is brand new, and the bosses within the bonus dungeons were returning ones from before, including Dolahan from the Anamos Inner Sanctum in the Lost Age. Plus, they felt that the overall plot did not feel like it fit well with the overall storyline of the franchise in general, as certain elements such as its characters ended up lacking in any character development, and the constant nods to that of the original Golden Sun became too overplayed. Plus, the newest lore within Wayard's history appearing all of a sudden in Dark Dawn, and not in the Game Boy Advance titles, would make many feel that the franchise comes off as inconsistent. It was even to this point where most of the game was focused on quests that were not directed toward the main goal at hand, thus coming off more as filler than important. It did not help that much either, when much of the original cast ended up being completely absent, and the antagonists of Blatos and Chalice were not as compelling as Saturos and Minardi, or even their worst replacements, Ageshu and Karst. Even the omission of the battle mode or any online functionality made Dark Dawn came off more depressing for those who were wanting more. In the end, many who were expecting more of what they loved from the Game Boy Advance games in the series came off of Dark Dawn feeling unfulfilled, as they felt it would have worked better as a spin-off or alternate universe that isn't canon to the main story. Probably the biggest reason what made fans feel that the game did not come off being that compelling as the other games is the fact that Camelot took too long to develop this game when this could have been a crown jewel early within the Nintendo DS's lifecycle, hence why the hoaxes were made beforehand. To this day, Golden Sun Dark Dawn on the Nintendo DS has sold nearly 800,000 copies worldwide, with most of the sales coming from the North American market for a third time. Unfortunately, it would mean that Dark Dawn comes off as the least selling installment of the entire franchise when it should have possibly been the biggest, with the Nintendo DS install base being that of over 150 million users on a global scale, and it did not help the fact that the game was developed and released long within the lifespan of the handheld. After Golden Sun Dark Dawn came out and failed to garner new fans to the series and to impress longtime fans, no more news has been made with Camelot Software Planning working on a fourth game to the overall franchise. In between many of these games' releases, characters within the franchise would make appearances in other games, while all of them would appear in alternate media that is non-canonical to the games. On the game front, Isaac would appear in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and he would make his debut as a full 3-dimensional character in the form of an assist trophy to help players in sticky situations, as Isaac would use his move synergy to push opponents off of platforms to make them fall off and be defeated. Isaac would also be a collectible trophy amongst the many others from Nintendo's large catalog of franchises, as well as the battle music and final boss theme from The Lost Age being available as a battle theme. Not only that, but the overworld theme of Golden Sun Dark Dawn was used as battle music in Super Smash Bros. For Nintendo 3DS and Wii U. sometime after the first game released in Japan, a Japanese-only unofficial doujin manga anthology of Golden Sun was published, and it was called Golden Sun 4 Gag Battle. It ended up being nothing but a collection of gags about the first game's characters and setting expressed in comic strips by a group of collaborating manga artists. From the perspective of the Golden Sun IP itself, this manga anthology is significant for being the only form of non-video game media that the series has appeared in as of yet, as no official manga of all three games has been created to this day, seeing as it originally started in Japan. Although the manga anthology is left exclusive in Japan, several fan-translated scans of all the pages of the manga have been uploaded online for people to view for their own pleasure. Other than that, nothing else has come about with characters from the Golden Sun franchise or any other iterations in other non-video game media has been conceived. In 2009, Camelot and Nintendo released a Wii port of Mario Power Tennis with new play controls to accommodate the controls of both the Wiimote and Nunchuck for more interactive play. Unfortunately, the game received mixed reviews for it mostly being reliant on motion controls that proved to be imprecise, which would ultimately ruin the entire experience. After Dark Dawn was released, the Takahashi Brothers and Camelot Software Planning continued to support Nintendo by releasing more of their signature tennis and golf games of the Mario Sports titles for the company and consumers with Mario Tennis Open, Mario Golf World Tour, and Mario Sports Superstars on the Nintendo 3DS, with the latter game being a joint collaboration between them and Bandai Namco Games, and Mario Tennis Ultra Smash on the Nintendo Wii U. Instead of continuing their streak of quality put into these sports titles, more of their sports games saw a continual decline, either because of relying on gimmicks with the stereoscopic 3D on the Nintendo 3DS installments, or because of the lack of content when it came to Mario Tennis Ultra Smash, Camelot Software Planning's first game made in high definition. This decrease in quality for their most recent games, including Golden Sun Dark Dawn, made many speculate that Camelot Software Planning was behind with the times when it comes to meeting the needs of publishers and consumers for today's gaming, or that the Takahashi Brothers were already past their prime, as their development methods were being more viewed as outdated for today's standards. Fortunately enough, both the original Golden Sun and the Lost Age have made it onto the Wii U Virtual Console in 2014 and 2015 for all regions around the world respectively, for older fans and newcomers to experience both games for themselves. As of now, Golden Sun Dark Dawn is the only Golden Sun game that hasn't been made readily available on the Wii U Virtual Console, with some holding out hope that it will soon arrive, or that the possibility is slim, due to the entry's unfavorable stance amongst players. The discussion amongst critics and players of there being a fourth outing in the Golden Sun franchise has constantly been brought up, even long after Dark Dawn came out and soured the minds of many of its longtime fans. When many of Nintendo's past franchises that remained dormant throughout the years and just recently returned after a long hiatus, Golden Sun is one of the brand names amongst Nintendo's IPs that fans want to throw out next when it came to another consideration. In an interview with Nintendo Gamer in June 2012, Hiroyuki Takahashi of Camelot Software Planning discussed the possibility of a fourth game in the Golden Sun series. Hiroyuki Takahashi explains that a big reason that he, his brother, and their development studio continue to make RPGs comes from the requests from all the people who enjoyed their RPGs in the past. Perhaps if the demand is enough from many Nintendo fans and users asking the company to make another Golden Sun game, then that will naturally lead to the development of such a game. This was most likely how Golden Sun Dark Dawn managed to become a reality after The Lost Age was released so many years before the DS entry. The demand was passionate and strong from longtime fans who were constantly begging for more than what they got out of 2 installments, even when the hoaxes would surface online. It's only been natural that many of Nintendo's dormant franchises getting a revival would either fail to live up to their past success or to become a smash hit to ensure more ventures into that particular property, which has been mostly the case with the Fire Emblem series in the most recent years of its existence. After Fire Emblem Awakening came out and went above and beyond what Intelligent Systems managed to do with the Fire Emblem IP and took the world by storm, many of its newest projects would try to go above and beyond what they established for every new game that comes out after the last one. The end result for each game would meet a similar amount of critical acclaim, much like Awakening managed to achieve. Besides, it would only be natural that Nintendo fans would want to see more of their favorite IPs make a return with an update in visuals and more resources put into new installments, whether it be from something like Star Fox, Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, and even most importantly, Golden Sun. Plenty of petitions on the internet have surfaced with many demanding that a fourth game should be underway, as it has been exactly as long as it was when Dark Dawn came out after The Lost Age. The demand for a new game from a franchise that is on hiatus is seen by its audience as an expectancy. But to better understand the fate of a series like Golden Sun, there are 4 different factors that should be considered by looking at many of the genre's past contemporaries, with the most notable examples being that of Square's Final Fantasy and Nintendo's flagship RPG franchise, Pokémon. The first factor is the RPG community, namely those who enjoy role-playing games through the video game format and continue to play them long after their release, breaking them down and learning all of their mechanics and intricacies. 2 of the biggest communities that play Japanese role-playing games are that of Final Fantasy and Pokémon. A game like Final Fantasy has become one of the most well-known video games because it's had a presence through many players' lives, whether it comes to the original releases of numerous entries or through their ports on numerous platforms. Practically anyone playing video games over nearly 2 to 3 decades could have accessed or encountered some version of Final Fantasy. It's a well-known franchise in the industry and one of Square Enix's current top sellers, resulting in one of the most dedicated fan bases. Unfortunately, this is not the case with Golden Sun, as it was only considered more popular in North America during the first game's initial release, making it one of the few JRPG franchises that actually sold better outside of its home country of Japan, which may have resulted why its tone was more amongst the mindset of a worldwide audience instead of Japan's alone. Those who continue to play JRPGs like Final Fantasy have many different reasons for being a part of that community, whether to share the same passion as their fellow enthusiasts, the chance to pursue a career in playing and dedicating to the JRPGs that they love, a pride of their local community or country, or simply the nature of bringing their vast knowledge and research to those who have a better understanding at many of the backstories behind certain elements in their creations. Like any video game that revolves around skill and intelligence of all a game's mechanics and intricacies, those players would be the ones that will always come out on top, garner respect among their peers, and obtain a sort of pseudo-celebrity status within the community. Eventually, people will not just become attracted to a popular JRPG, but also to the fans that surround it, viewing unknown players as underdogs, the go-to person for knowledge on a particular title, and create long-term partnerships to bring about an extraneous source of information within communities. Over the years, the Final Fantasy and Pokémon communities have managed and succeeded to reach beyond their customary bounds and enter the video game mainstream media through word-of-mouth and viral videos. When many JRPG franchises like Final Fantasy and Pokémon were receiving lesser praise, attention, and weaker publicity when Western RPGs were doing more of the opposite in the mid to late 2000s, it was a period that many would often refer to as the Dark Age of JRPGs, as there were no other compelling options when it came to the overall genre. That belief technically was not even truthful, as many other compelling JRPGs were made by other companies at the time, as even Square and Nintendo continued to put out other great JRPGs too. But this whole perception represented the magnitude of the void felt by a large and passionate community, as well as possibly their indifference. For longtime fans of Japanese role-playing games, Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were their first attraction to the genre on home consoles, while Pokémon was their first attraction when it came to handhelds. Over time, they mostly gravitated together through each new series before settling into more luxurious and passionate communities. Final Fantasy VI, because of its many risks the developer took to go beyond what was already established for a base theme that was running dry in its course. Final Fantasy VII, which wiped the slate entirely clean and made a game that secured a more universal and realistic appeal after being mostly a 2D sprite-based franchise. Pokemon Gold and Silver, because of all the possibilities that went beyond what they saw in Red and Blue during the days of the original Game Boy, and Pokemon X and Y because of its advancements that made many felt that the series wasn't getting that substantial leap with newer and more creative ideas from prior installments in between. Long after either of these games were released, their passion allowed them to remain within the video game zeitgeist and played a key role into their eventual returns, thanks to advocates like Jaywitz, Loxton and Noggin, and Chugga Conroy when it comes to Pokemon, and Mr. Happy 1227, H.C. Bailey, Gerard the Completionist, and Pro Jared when it comes to Final Fantasy. When Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn and Final Fantasy XV along with Pokemon Sun and Moon were released, they were seen by both of their respective communities as the current big focus. The argument amongst fans about which Final Fantasy game or Pokemon generation being the absolute best are two of those debates that are always argued and never settled. But the truth of the matter is that these games were seen as the replacements of the predecessors in their respective communities. The overall popularity of any role-playing game comes down to a matter of brand recognition and the present community size. Nowadays, a role-playing game would have to be built on a long-running or well-known beloved franchise in order to reach any level of mass appeal within the video game industry. If a new or relatively smaller role-playing game community wanted to get the attention of the bigger communities, they would have to have a large enough number of people playing their game exclusively that they can't seemingly go unnoticed forever. Having said that, it feels that should be the case with the Golden Sun games, since the series was conceived during the time when Japanese role-playing games were at the peak of their popularity, but as a result in being from Nintendo, Golden Sun also suffered the perpetual challenge to stand out amongst the Pokemon franchise back then, and even today, along with the more recent Xenoblade Chronicles games from Monolith Soft and their competitors that had and still have a larger presence during those times. Plus, it didn't help that many of the characters didn't have that same high level of appeal and familiarity as those found in Final Fantasy or Pokemon. To this day, it still faces that challenge of finding a dedicated audience of players large enough to stand out with the other big Japanese role-playing games from Square Enix or even Nintendo. For instance, Square Enix and Nintendo have released newer and older Japanese role-playing games alongside Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, Final Fantasy XV, Pokemon Sun and Moon, and the Xenoblade Chronicles games. While a number of these games have had their share of fans and even started their own dedicated communities, the number of players who are still actively playing them pale in comparison to that of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, Final Fantasy XV, Pokemon Sun and Moon, and the Xenoblade franchise. So those players would have to work harder to make their presence known, or else their games of choice would only be seen as a passing curiosity and likely to never be heard from again. Players can appreciate role-playing games of all types, but like any other gaming community to a particular genre, the RPG community is notorious for their unsympathetic nature when it comes to acknowledging the newer or smaller ones because at the end of the day, these communities are playing and supporting the franchises they favor and are not responsible for the welfare of the others. But as the RPG community's reach has grown much larger thanks to some connectivity of online elements and social media, it's also necessary to become more open to newer role-playing games and their dedicated audiences to sustain that growth. Those who organize events based around role-playing games and want them to grow must also choose what game or franchise they wish to showcase at their local gatherings or worldwide events based around that community size. Even if presentations had the more well-known figureheads that pushed for less popular role-playing games, no company would want to host them if there is a low turnout of those familiar to that particular franchise, and even those who play role-playing games as a hobby or as a profession in a rare case would have no reason with investing their time to support many of them if there's little or no amount of financial gain for them. The second factor is based around the video game companies that continue to make role-playing games. When both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy became a huge hit for both Enix and Square on home consoles, and Pokemon Red and Blue became a smash hit for Nintendo on the portable handhelds, they sparked a newfound interest in Japanese RPGs on a global scale. Naturally, Square seized the opportunity and rapidly increased their JRPG output on a yearly basis. This rising popularity of Japanese role-playing games were also seen by other big-name Japanese companies at the time, which also produced a number of JRPG franchises of their own. This was likely the only way Square was able to produce another JRPG series like Seiken Densetsu, the Saga series, and later with Kingdom Hearts. In Enix's case, Dragon Quest's popularity in Japan would also give rise to Quintet's Creation Trilogy and Star Ocean on the Super Famicom, along with Valkyrie Profile on the Sony PlayStation. It would also be the same thing as Camelot Software Planning was able to conceive and create Golden Sun after Pokemon Red and Blue were able to revolutionize RPGs on portable gaming handhelds. In order to produce so many JRPGs on a regular basis, these companies would have to reuse various game assets or slightly alter them in order to make enough new content for each of their newer iterations and installments. For many of these developers, releasing a Japanese role-playing game outside of their country didn't really enter their minds. When they created Japanese RPGs, they were primarily toward those who are native to their home country, and they were their final destination or goal. Because of that, there were so many installments with many familiar and fewer new mechanics to keep them alive and to avoid the risk of alienation amongst their audiences. Not to mention, there were so many different ports and versions of the same title whenever a re-release was to occur. This ability to have so many newer installments and many different updates through various ports allowed developers to continue balancing and iterating on their JRPGs, and adding a new layer of mechanics to each new game. Some of these newer installments of the big hit JRPG franchises from Square and Nintendo could be seen as a direct result of these said circumstances. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn, which encompasses the many years of the franchise's existence, with several of their past cast elements brought in to be updated and add more relevancy and freshness to the overall experience, Pokemon X and Y for being the last core title to keep true to its core, as Pokemon Sun and Moon would break away from those traditions to begin anew with something fresh. The Tales series from Bandai Namco and Kingdom Hearts from Square Enix were getting new installments mostly on a year-by-year basis. Companies like Square, Sony, Sega, Konami, Tecmo, and Capcom became the earliest pioneers when it came to 3D polygonal JRPGs, even if some of them retained 2D sprites on their characters, monsters, and bosses. With so much rapid Japanese RPG output, their influence and presence managed to spread into other mediums and genres besides role-playing games. Even if most of those endeavors are largely seen as duds for today, it still left an impression on their fans, and their pursuits by companies demonstrate just how remunerative Japanese RPG brands were to video game companies at the time. But as time went on, the interest in new JRPGs began to decline, and companies that have once thrived on this particular genre began to see diminishing returns on new franchises. Perhaps it had more to do with the decline in quality for many of these Japanese RPGs during the 2000s, the rise of more popular genres with their newer franchises, or the fact that new players simply did not want to learn another role-playing game with even more complicated mechanics. There will always be players who can appreciate a good JRPG, but a large majority of them are drawn more to the spectacle than the underlying gameplay mechanics. As development costs were on the rise, many of these developers who thrived on Japanese role-playing games were on the verge of bankruptcy, or others simply faded away because of this inevitable circumstance. However, many of these companies who were threatened by this particular doom managed to stay alive by being acquired and/or absorbed into other companies, such as the most recent case with Atlas now being owned by Sega, along with Monolith Soft now being owned by Nintendo, and with companies merging together to form newer business entities, such as Square and Enix to become Square Enix, Koei and Tecmo to become Koei Tecmo Games, and Bandai Namco to become Bandai Namco Entertainment. Meanwhile, many of these developers began straying away from just solely making JRPGs and began to expand into other genres on home video game consoles and other markets.
今までファイナルファンタジーとかそういうものを作ってきたんですけれど、2009年にスクエア・エニックスとモントリオールがグループ会社になって、その時にコラボして何かやろうかっていうところからスタートしたプロジェクトでいい刺激になりました。モントリオールのクリエイターたちのアートと東京のスタジオのアート技術がうまく融合して良いトレーラーができたかなと。
With this transition, many companies like Square Enix were becoming less known as just a Japanese RPG company and more as a video game company that also makes Japanese role-playing games, a similar vein of how Nintendo has always been with their business practice in home consoles and video games since the NES up until now, as the Pokemon franchise only represents one piece of their overall library of IPs. Square Enix would continue to make JRPGs, but most of their Japanese RPG franchises would be worked on and outsourced to newer developers in different companies. In order for Square Enix, Nintendo, and companies like them to maintain sustainability, Japanese RPGs became a smaller piece to a larger portfolio of video games. Despite these companies with their overall shift in focus, many of their former rivals still continue to make newer entries of their famous JRPGs, while newer companies came in with their own take on the overall formula. However, those who were just seen as pumping out sequels eventually led to diminishing returns. It got to a point where new big-budget Japanese role-playing games, whose selling factors were based on gimmicks and shock value alone, would not even work anymore.
By using the power of paint, Mario can restore functionality to certain colorless objects that won't work without their color. Even toads will spring back to life. Solve the puzzles hidden around the island to find the way forward. Sometimes you may even need to cut out a part of the world to find a hidden path. Watch out, there are traps hiding everywhere. These are just a few of the crazy things that await you.
Other Japanese companies came into the genre with their own original role-playing games and proved that JRPGs that used classic 2D character sprites could still be engaging enough to establish its own dedicated community. However, many of them struggled to have that much success beyond their devoted niche audiences due to their low recognition and brand awareness outside of that audience. These Japanese RPGs have such a small audience that they are often typecasted by other RPG communities as a subgenre within Japanese role-playing games. Nowadays, the ability and tools to create a whole new role-playing game with Japanese appeal have become more accessible than ever before. With smaller production teams and budgets, it's easier for a new JRPG to find success and make a profit, not based on sales numbers, but through the help of a small dedicated audience, thanks to certain opportunities like crowdfunding and contracting to ensure a small independent developer's sustainability. Many of these smaller companies are mostly known for producing their respective JRPGs as their sole focus, whereas the older Japanese companies who were once pioneers to the JRPG genre persevere by producing, developing, and publishing a breadth of video games spanning all genres and on all platforms. Even Final Fantasy, despite being one of Square's oldest and highest-selling franchises, went through a series of trials and tribulations before getting a new installment released to a worldwide audience. Fortunately, it still had that large existing community that would support the series, proving a new installment's marketability, and people who could effectively contribute to its production. Now, since many of these JRPGs only represent a smaller piece of these companies' overall puzzle, more would be gained when they would be investing into more familiar brands like Final Fantasy and Pokemon than an original and more dormant brand like Golden Sun, thanks to having a large and active install base. No longer as advantageous as they once were, most business pursuits outside of the JRPG brands, mainly the Japanese RPGs themselves, have undergone smaller productions and have such little risks attached to them. Instead of giving full focus on releasing packaged retail games on many franchises like what was done in the past, many companies have begun to experiment by creating spin-offs or ports of popular franchises or even newer JRPGs that undergo a free-to-play model and microtransactions. Not only that, but they would also create games that would be exclusively tailored to newer markets and audiences that tend to favor playing games through platforms like web browsers, mobile phones, or even tablets. It's a recurring issue many video game companies continue to face when they focus on developing more familiar games with a greater chance of success, while investing less in new and original games with more financial risks. That's why it's become more difficult for Square Enix and Nintendo, or any other company for that matter, to create a sequel to a dormant brand or a new original JRPG using the older and more primitive design model that could duplicate the sales or lasting effect of a series like Final Fantasy or Pokemon. It would need to do something neither of them or any other developer has done before, or couldn't be done by them, in order to come close to matching their successes. New Japanese RPGs can still sell well and or get good reviews when they release, especially if it's an older or established brand, but public interest can always eventually falter. With the growing majority of the video game audience around the world, outside of Japan, already adverse to new and original JRPGs, they won't get far on mechanics alone, as they would have to do something stellar in order to make any impact at all. Otherwise, they'll just be brushed aside, and be known as just another video game company with no substantial waves to make their own games compelling, only to be plagued by the small minority of players who are long made aware of them and choose to remain devoted to them. The third factor would have to deal with an individual or video game company's development methods when working in the gaming industry for today, and adapting to the needs to compel a whole new audience. Back when video games would be made commercial to the public, their base designs and the understanding of certain hardware, along with their limitations and capabilities, were easy enough for developers to be more creative with the types of games they could make, along with the amount of resources they had, before they got unanimously gargantuan-sized for today's industry. Many of these older games were much easier to thrive, and to make a developer and publisher win back the cost they put out in developing, publishing, and marketing a game they just created. This was mostly true for Nintendo's reign in the video game market since the days of the Famicom and Super Famicom, since they wanted to prevent another video game crash from happening, like what went on in North America in 1983 to 1984. As draconian and archaic as their policies were back in the day, when someone like the late Hiroshi Yamauchi was Nintendo's president, the limited number of games released per year on the Nintendo platforms was a way to help not only Nintendo, but third parties maintain a level of quality assurance so that they don't go insane on quantity over quality with no chance at making any sort of profit and sustainability within their own respective businesses. It wouldn't last forever when Square and Nintendo ended up cutting ties with each other when Final Fantasy VII was being worked on, and the king of Japanese RPGs went over to develop games on the Sony PlayStation, with many other third parties following suit after seeing Hiroshi Yamauchi's bad influence. By separating themselves from being restricted on Nintendo's hardware, their freedom with going to other platforms like the PlayStation brand, Xbox brand, and on PC has opened up so many avenues for opportunities to come about that they could not even imagine doing during their heydays. As time went on, though, that same ambitious and unilateral attitude got out of hand that many of these third parties who were once king of the hill have fallen from grace due to how the technology was always evolving and that development costs were becoming much more bloated and inflated. That unfortunate circumstance would prove to a developer and publisher that chances of financial success were far more risky, and the poor sales of a game could see diminishing returns and suffer financial losses as a result. That's why companies in this day and age like Capcom have a hard time with developing new games from long-existing franchises or even newer IPs on home video game consoles or handhelds like the PlayStation Vita and the Nintendo 3DS because of their own hubris, that they are trying to port many of their back catalog to newer platforms in hopes to recoup their losses. Those who are suffering during these tumultuous times have had their fair share of little success and little financial gain due to their mistakes. But when newer blood within leadership inside a company changes, as they have newer ideas that could help reinvigorate their business model and to make more money for themselves, they could be seen as those who have once fell from grace but are climbing back up to their former glory, which they achieved in their past for modern times. For example, when Yuichi Wada led Square Enix for a long time, his ways of handling the publisher and development teams led the company down a dark path due to the changes within the times, and eventually Yosuke Matsuda would succeed him, as he had a new development philosophy for Square Enix to thrive once again. Instead of focusing on a large number of AAA games coming from themselves, they would focus their output on at least 1 to 2 AAA games a year, while having so many mid-tier projects to fill in the gaps between each big blockbuster title that was soon to arrive. It's been that way ever since, and the company has managed to achieve more profit and sustainability because of these changes, despite several shortcomings that they still struggle with from within their business. Nintendo was more on a middle ground when it came to their hardware, as their handhelds would continue to make a profit for their war chests on a yearly basis, while they had success and failures with their home consoles. However, their games wouldn't go above and beyond what many companies were becoming more ambitious towards as the times were slowly changing every decade. Nintendo would usually come up with what they saw best in their hardware so that they could in turn make a profit, but their games maintained such a high level of quality that the impressive review scores could easily win them back so much money they invested in the development toward many of their games. Super Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Pokemon, and others that contributed to their financial gain. On the other hand, they were slowly becoming more out of touch with the standards and needs of consumers, as certain areas like online gaming and social media would have a significant impact on the growth and sustainability of a franchise and brand's life cycle. It's a problem that continues to plague within Nintendo's boundaries, as even though they have taken small steps to achieve some of those spectacles with what people want, but they haven't fully adapted to all of those needs with what gamers expect in a new game. For instance, there are those who want to see a 2D or 3D Mario game incorporate online multiplayer. They want to see a new Star Fox with online matches, since games like Halo 2 on the Xbox made online multiplayer on consoles extremely popular in 2004, and people want to see a Pokemon game undergo in the genre of a massive multiplayer online role-playing game, since they could join up and battle other people from around the world, outside of ad hoc and local wireless connectivity they see on the handhelds like the Nintendo 3DS. Perhaps it is this understanding that make many more believe that Nintendo and the people who develop for them are not adapting to their needs of what they want to see be put in or to evolve in that said franchise. When going back to Golden Sun, it was a game that worked well on a handheld where it mostly retained its place as a platform for 2D pixelated sprites, and the Takahashi Brothers and Camelot put all of their effort and resources to make a game and its sequel stand the test of time for not only its visuals, but its music and gameplay that they found to be highly compelling. They saw a similar success when it came to the Mario Golf and Mario Tennis games on consoles like the Nintendo 64 and GameCube, as well as venturing into RPG mechanics with Mario Golf Advance Tour and Mario Tennis Power Tour on the Game Boy Advance with great results. Unfortunately, their development philosophies began to take a nosedive after the mixed reception of Mario Power Tennis on the Wii through Nintendo's new Play Control series of games that were once on the GameCube ported to the Wii. Golden Sun Dark Dawn was no exception, as even though it got a generally positive reception, the overall sales did not make the game past the 1 million mark. As a matter of fact, the entire series has not passed the 5 to 10 million mark in overall sales, hence the reason why no sequel to Golden Sun Dark Dawn has been made as of yet may be due to the fact that Camelot did not make back the revenue of the game's overall sales to consider it a commercial success, and that their only ventures in making money has been more attributed to continuously making golf and tennis games with Mario and Company attached to sports. After all, Mario is the biggest and most profitable franchise of all time, as anything that has the Italian plumber in a game can leave Nintendo rest assured that they will make back so much revenue on their biggest IP alone. Unfortunately, the most recent iterations of the Mario Golf and Mario Tennis games under the development of Camelot have each not passed the 1 million mark in global sales, even after Golden Sun Dark Dawn was released. many began seeing Camelot Software Planning as a company who was once innovative with their design choice in the games they worked on, to becoming downgraded as an average developer, where Nintendo can go and make a cash grab, even if the quality of the Mario Tennis and Mario Golf games on the 3DS and Wii U were subpar in their delivery. It could also be speculated that both Hiroyuki Takahashi and Shugo Takahashi were already past their prime, as their development methods were now becoming more viewed as outdated and hardly up to snuff with the demands that gamers want to see in their games for today. Nintendo has had the same problem, ever since 3D gaming became a thing and was evolving into a more advanced medium than just something that could be easily put out within a year of development. However, they have slowly but surely been getting over these hurdles, and the output on most of their recent outings have achieved tremendous results when looking outside of trying to incorporate gimmicks to make their games become relevant from a hardware standpoint to a software standpoint. When it comes to those who still haven't fully adapted to these times, with where game development has transitioned to as of right now, Camelot Software Planning is one of the few that is fully behind with the times. It can be made rightfully so, as Mario Tennis Ultra Smash on the Wii U was the developer's first game made in high definition, and the lack of content made it a bare-bones type of experience, when in contrast to something more fun and intuitive like Mario Power Tennis on the GameCube. If Camelot Software Planning and the Takahashi Brothers ever want to rise up in grace once more, they would need to cope with the reality of how much more difficult it is to develop a game with just a small group like themselves that consists of only 42 employees who work in a small studio, must receive extra manpower and resources to create a game that can fit the standards, the needs, and the possibilities of what fans want to see in a new Golden Sun if a fourth game were to ever release. Financially, if it weren't a possible task, then collaborations with other fellow developers under Nintendo, like Intelligent Systems or even Monolith Soft, would be trustworthy candidates to make a franchise that is possibly viewed as dated to rise up like the sun and shine with quality once more. Even both of these companies had to face these harsh realities when working on a new Fire Emblem or a new IP like Xenoblade Chronicles for Nintendo. Both of them took a risk with creating games that would go past what was already established for the Fire Emblem series and what was truly lacking in Japanese RPGs during the latter half of the 2000s, and the risks paid off for both games, as Fire Emblem is now amongst Nintendo's top-selling IPs after Awakening went on to receive critical acclaim, and Xenoblade Chronicles reigniting that spark to make Japanese RPGs brim with quality and innovation after a dark period of 5 years. Nowadays, both franchises continue to breathe life in attributing to the profits and the sales from the more recent games like Fire Emblem Echoes Shadows of Valentia and possibly Xenoblade Chronicles 2 that has already released on the Nintendo Switch. It seems like that should be the case for something like Golden Sun, as what Camelot Software Planning and the Takahashi Brothers could have done for Golden Sun Dark Dawn might have continued to shine a light on the franchise's legacy to stay alive with newer games. Sadly, that isn't the case, as the developer is so small, so taking the chance of increasing output to make a game that was once small become even more ambitious could financially break the company and become a lost relic if such a large risk were to be taken upon that magnitude. However, working together with a more competent developer who has a very large understanding of the standards in today's industry of game development like Monolith Soft is probably what Camelot Software Planning needs to pursue and plead at Nintendo to make a new Golden Sun become a reality. It would also make leeway for the franchise to appear on a console suitable for home, or that acts as a hybrid between home and portable gaming like the Nintendo Switch, and incorporate some things that players for today's gaming are begging for in whatever is being worked on. Otherwise, if they continue going by their beliefs, and if the Takahashi Brothers don't adapt more to today's gaming, then they will continue to be left on the wayside, becoming a company that has failed not because of a lack of manpower or extra resources for their most recent games, but based on the fact that Camelot Software Planning has become fully out of touch with reality. The fourth and final factor is one that is often disregarded by players, but is perhaps the most important factor of all. It goes beyond simply a video game's sales potential or even the RPG community. It's the matter of inheritance. Nowadays, many popular video games are not just seen as associated with a company, but rather a single designer or a team within that company, often the main lead or the figureheads of a franchise, as it is no different when it comes to Japanese role-playing games. For example, the JRPG franchise Dragon Quest by Square Enix is well known among its fans for being created by the collaborative efforts of Yuji Horii, Koichi Sugiyama, and Akira Toriyama, who are each responsible for the overall game design, the compositions within the music, and the character designs for each mainline entry respectively. They've all worked on other role-playing games within and outside of their team during all these years, but when it comes to Dragon Quest, their inspirations and influences can still be seen throughout each game's entire design to this very day. Other examples include Star Ocean and Valkyrie Profile, both of which are also owned by Square Enix, having Yoshiharu Gotanda, Nier and Drakengard having Yoko Taro, Xenoblade Chronicles having Tetsuya Takahashi, Pokemon having Junichi Masuda, the Mother series originally having Shigesato Itoi, the Tales series formerly having Hideo Baba, Final Fantasy originally having Hironobu Sakaguchi as he currently has Terra Battle, and Kingdom Hearts having Tetsuya Nomura. Many of these people have been with their respective franchises since their early inception, and while some of them have changed positions or had their development teams changed over the years, they are still associated to these games to a degree and hold a strong influence to where a video game series goes moving forward. For many of these game developers, working on another game in a long-running series not just becomes a tradition, but an inevitability.
An evil empire is sucking the life force from the planet, destroying all that's in its path. It's up to one soldier of fortune to save the world. If he succeeds, you survive. If he fails, you can always hit the reset button. Final Fantasy VII. Only on PlayStation.
For they are coming back. At last, the promise has been made.
When it comes to Final Fantasy, one of the biggest misconceptions players have is that there was always a single team or figurehead like Hironobu Sakaguchi within Square who was responsible for producing and directing each mainline installment since the beginning. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The teams responsible for each iteration and installment of Final Fantasy have contained different groups of producers, artists, animators, and programmers led by a different main designer whose influences and inspirations have come from very different sources. The distinctions between all the different mainline games and meta-series brands of Final Fantasy have become much clearer over the years with its fans, resulting in various preferences over iterations and installments. Every game made at Square or any other company have had their own development team with members who have varying levels of experience. The more seasoned veterans would teach the younger and less experienced members on the team, some of whom would go on to inherit their role on a future project. Over the years, designers who started working on a single department for one video game could potentially become the directors or producers of another game until they either choose to depart from the company or are promoted to a higher executive position where they would oversee a number of projects at once, all the while paving a way for newer and younger members to take up the positions they left behind. It has been reported that a number of Square Enix's designers had departed the company to become freelance, start newer companies with smaller scale games due to the growth of higher development costs, or to start over from scratch with game development once again. But while the most high-profile producers behind Square Enix's Japanese RPGs left to work on others or to start their own companies like others before them, a number of the lesser-known designers who had worked under them would remain at the company to work on new and original projects until they would inherit their own development team. Those designers who have chose to move into freelance work are able to use their experiences to contribute their talents to more companies, including Square Enix, if they choose to rehire them for a new project. Each of these teams brought with them their own experiences and visions to their respective projects. During their time, they received all types of criticism internally from within the team and externally from longtime fans over every aspect of their version of a game. Whether it be new characters in a Final Fantasy game who were believed to be incapable of having the same timeless appeal like the ones from prior installments, or newer features and mechanics that many felt were not befitting to an established series, all the while unaware that the teams working on them internally at Square Enix were different from the ones that came before them. This has arguably been one of the hardest challenges for a new Golden Sun game from within Camelot Software Planning and Nintendo to become a reality. Some, if not all of the development team responsible for some or all of the games, have either departed from Camelot Software Planning and Nintendo some time ago or have moved on to work on other projects for both companies. Due to the cryptic nature of Japanese game development back then, and the lack of public information available, it's difficult for anyone to really know everyone who is a part of the original development team or is considered the figurehead of the franchise. Although it is official that the Takahashi Brothers are the true creators of the Golden Sun series, the lack of passion to stand by the IP's inheritance, the lack of creative new ideas to broaden the franchise's appeal, or simply being tasked with working on more Mario sports titles for Nintendo are probably the most likely reasons why a new Golden Sun game has not been greenlit for production. Theoretically, a new development team could be built up within Camelot Software Planning and Nintendo to work on a brand new Golden Sun game. Another company could also be contracted or outsourced to do the same job. These questions of who would or wouldn't be a worthy candidate to take up such a position are discussions that hardcore fans often love to theorize about. But they tend to forget how controversial these decisions can be. Plus, these new teams would face the same difficult challenges and pressures faced by the new teams responsible for creating a new Xenoblade Chronicles or even a new core Pokemon game. Like many of the previous designers who worked on the Final Fantasy franchise for Square, or even the Tales series for Bandai Namco, they would have no senior members of the original teams to turn to for advice. The unique perspective these original producers could have contributed is now gone. A majority of those people have moved on, taking with them their influences, direction, and vision. But it's not just the matter of inheriting the work from a prior team they would have to overcome. There's also the matter of inheriting all of the expectations and baggage that's been built up by the series' longtime fans, the vocal minority who crave for something new while also wanting more of the same. This new team would have to create characters and mechanics to fill a new vision in Japanese RPG design, but the influence they would draw from is completely different than what it was from the old team from those many years ago. Creating a new Golden Sun game would be a difficult task for the development team, who would have to struggle to appeal to a large audience who will play the latest Pokemon but cares little for a new Golden Sun, as well as the much smaller audience who continue to play the Game Boy Advance titles in the franchise and are knowledgeable when it comes to Golden Sun. The harshest critics could easily point to this new team's prior experience with JRPGs, or lack thereof, as evidence that they would be incapable of meeting the franchise's standards, and would be accused of being more likely to tarnish its legacy outright. Viewing its development from the outside, most dedicated fans would argue over everything the team should be doing, rather than what they are attempting, and if it doesn't live up to all of their expectations for one reason or another, this development team would forever be seen as the scapegoat in the events of the franchise's demise, following its release. Either way, the new team would be in a damned if they do, damned if they don't type of situation. Monolith Soft took a chance when it came to Xenoblade Chronicles on the Wii when Japanese role-playing games were in a state of decline, and the gamble paid off for them. With Xenoblade Chronicles, the developer and Nintendo were praised for revitalizing the Japanese RPG genre, but its success has brought new realities they would have to face moving forward. Since JRPGs have declined in quality during the 2000s, there's been a period of time when some, if not all of these Japanese RPGs were still being exclusively produced by their parent teams within their parent companies, while most others focused on collaborative efforts to make a new game become a reality. If a company like Square Enix chose to produce a new numbered Final Fantasy game, they would need to team up and outsource their work to other teams by going above and beyond what they managed to do with the previous game when coming up with a new one. Despite these developers' varied experiences when it came to producing Japanese role-playing games, they designed new games that managed to satisfy a large but selective audience, but their experience remains not as consistent or extensive as their more seasoned contemporaries. Tetsuya Takahashi is well regarded as being instrumental in breathing back life to Japanese role-playing games, and his design philosophy for Xenoblade Chronicles can be seen as a blueprint to help shape up all future JRPGs not only from within themselves, but for other companies. But the truth is, his background in working on Japanese RPGs came off more as artist and graphics design roles, having worked on a number of games for Square, before departing and having more executive director roles for his games at Monolith Soft. Since then, he has remained with his development company as president and CEO, even after Nintendo bought all of their shares in 2007, and the whole development team have been given much creative freedom when it comes to their own projects while still contributing to others for Nintendo, mainly that to the Legend of Zelda franchise, as their experiences with Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles X are what made the large open-world aspect become a reality in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild for the Nintendo Switch and the Wii U. Taking all of these different factors into consideration, it seems like the future of the Golden Sun franchise within Camelot Software Planning appears very grim. If it ever hopes to make a return like many other franchises before it, it would have to garner enough public attention and support outside of its already dedicated fan base to acquire the larger mindshare of the RPG communities and prove to be a worthwhile endeavor to both Camelot Software Planning and, most importantly, Nintendo. These are very difficult challenges that cannot be easily dealt with due to Golden Sun always being a relatively obscure franchise. It's also been a concern for longtime fans whether or not Golden Sun could even make the transition into a modern design successfully, whether it be in the form of an enhanced remake or that of a reboot with more of the mindset of a high-definition game on home consoles, given the series a clear inclination of the bizarre and unorthodox. The original games had a rare balance of being more down-to-earth and not overly serious while being very tongue-in-cheek in a thematical sense. To many people familiar with Golden Sun by name only, it could be perceived that Golden Sun was just another video game series only capable of existing and thriving for its time, when Japanese role-playing games were considered a popular and booming market. In a way, Golden Sun was a series that managed to exist because of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Pokemon. However, it can also be argued that these three franchises managed to grow and evolve thanks to many other JRPG properties like Golden Sun. Since the Golden Sun games were originally being developed long after the Shining franchise with Sega, as well as Beyond the Beyond with Sony on the original PlayStation, they share so many design and development philosophies between each other. When a new mechanic or feature was introduced and experimented with by the development team of one Japanese role-playing game, it would be iterated and refined upon, and later reappear in another. Many of Camelot's innovations from the Shining Force games and Beyond the Beyond could still be seen and refined in their newer franchises such as Golden Sun. For example, when Shining Force first introduced the angular perspective of characters utilizing their combat abilities against opponents in a brief attack through a tactic-style battle, that same perspective was brought back and used as the positions of the main characters and enemies in random enemy and boss encounters in Beyond the Beyond by using 3D camera panning, and later using a 2D background to give it a similar effect in the Golden Sun games. When Shining Force 3 released 3 different discs to encompass the entire overarching anthology of that game, it would later be used as the basis between Golden Sun and its continuation, The Lost Age. The same could be said about the series' other features being refined upon or completely original, like the Gene system and the Synergy system used to solve various puzzles within the field of travel. The influences from Shining Force and Beyond the Beyond would go beyond the Golden Sun series and become even expanded upon by many other contemporaries who made them more streamlined and engaging for consumers to this day. By the time when Super Smash Bros. Was able to introduce characters and elements from the Golden Sun series in some way, shape, or form, through stickers or even having an assist trophy of Isaac in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, it became more than just a simple matter of fan service, but proof of how its innovations and ideas could be refined upon and worked more smoothly in a number of video games outside of the franchise's JRPG roots. Countless other influences can be traced in many other JRPGs outside of the ones that are put out by Nintendo, and boundless possibilities for improving on its foundations can still be seen in other games and Nintendo's current leader in the department of Japanese role-playing games on home consoles, Xenoblade Chronicles. As several development teams return to the spotlight to reinvigorate themselves with newer JRPGs on both home consoles and handhelds after Xenoblade Chronicles' success, a number of those games can still be seen placing a stronger emphasis on their contemporaries, as Golden Sun is one of them. One of the core design philosophies when it came to Camelot Software Planning when working on Golden Sun was to make an original game that was truly different from others that came before it, as seen with its mechanics and cast of characters. The designer's bold choice to take an approach is so contrary to what many game companies were vying to imitate at the time, in time enabling them to strive for something unusual, but taking it to a new level than anything that anyone has seen before. While Golden Sun is not the first Japanese RPG to feature a story that revolves around saving the world by restoring life and bringing back the power of the 4 elements like Final Fantasy was more famous for doing, the developer's aspiration for the unconventional was taken upon a different angle, resulting in a story that felt more down-to-earth, and with most characters that appeared eccentric, enjoyable, and lively with unrivaled appeal and charm that couldn't be matched by others. Because of this, Golden Sun has remained enduring to many players, not because of its well-established and cleverly crafted game mechanics, but also simply because it's just an amazing game to watch and marvel at because of its overall story. The series' unique approach in story and character design can be considered as inspired that they can still be drawn as inspiration for other role-playing games that have been produced over the years. Golden Sun as a Japanese role-playing game will probably never manage to reach the popularity and success of Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Pokemon, or even the biggest one that came after it with Xenoblade Chronicles. But seeing and understanding the amount of influence it has had over the years on so many video games, Golden Sun also shouldn't be a series that remains largely unknown to anyone that can appreciate a great role-playing game. Golden Sun is still praised by its longtime fans and community for its depth, appeal, and overall mechanics, and there are those who still even show their appreciation to the entire series by appearing at local and major conventions where they dress up as some of their favorite characters as a way of bringing about dedication to that particular franchise. The opportunity for the series to grow in brand awareness and popularity has become more facilitated when compared to the games and their original release, thanks to its community of longtime fans who continue to show their love and dedication to the franchise in the form of reviews, let's plays, and through live streams on streaming sites like YouTube and Twitch, as well as Nintendo continuing to give it some publicity whenever that chance is to arise. Whether or not Golden Sun will ever return in the form of a new JRPG installment is never a sure thing. given the current environment of Japanese role-playing games within the video game industry. As with the case for any franchise that has remained dormant for long periods of time, its so-called return can be considered inevitable by its die-hard audience, but not as something that can always be predicted or determined accurately. The difference with these different types of video games is that the chances for their return and success are always brought up to a company on a case-by-case basis. When people cannot easily perceive when such a thing will ever become a reality, they are more inclined to see its prospects as being dead, confirming self-fulfilled preconceptions. And yet, the spirit of Golden Sun and what it represented could still be found throughout, whether it be on its dedicated community of players from around the world, or its constant influence and presence in video games from Camelot Software Planning, Nintendo or otherwise, both literally and intrinsically. In a way, it can also be seen that Golden Sun, not just as a game, but as a brand and a design philosophy, has never really shown signs of truly being dead. And it never will.